Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 1. It had rained steadily all morning. Stephen had been dimly conscious of the tinkle of the water as it trickled from an end gable and struck the pebbles of the path beneath. When it gradually quieted and finally stopped, he became distracted. The silence was much more disturbing than the noise had been. He turned and looked out the window. On the far fringe of the black heavens, he found a silver-gray band which widened as he watched, for the somber clouds were scudding to the east. Stephen was caught by the strength and symmetry of the trees, as they stood silhouetted against the dark sky. Immediately below him, he saw that the yellow flowers shone more brilliantly than they ever did under the summer sun. Strange, he mused aloud. I never noted that before. Darkness brings out beauty. After the cleansing rain, and in the shade of the hurrying black storm clouds, the garden was showing tints and tones that it hid when the sky was brilliant. The green of grass and leaf seemed softer, livelier, more glowing. The reds were warmer. Even the purple that fringed the curved petals of the fleurs de lis was richer than more royal. As he turned back to his writing, Stephen wondered if souls too were not seen best in shadow. Picking up his stylus, he poised it in midair and focused his eyes on it. He thought of Robert, the old giant of Malem. Unquestionably, the statement was true of him. The shadowy background of trouble silhouetted his gigantic character and edged the mighty virtues of his soul. Stephen again bent over his desk and was about to continue his writing when the squishy clop-clop of a slow-footed horse came to him from the road beyond his window. He looked and saw a black-cowled rider whose clothes sagged clammily and told of long hours in the rain. Stephen could only see the man swaying back, but as the horse and rider rounded the curve of the yard, he thought, whoever he is a tired man. Not very long after, there came a tap on the abbot's door. Who could this be at such an hour, he wondered. He opened the door in puzzlement, but recognition and pleasure immediately took its place. Before the lay brother who stood there could say a word, Stephen strode past him, threw his arms around the black-robed stranger, kissed him on both cheeks, and cried delightedly, "Peter, Peter, Peter!" "Be careful, Reverend Father," protested the enfolded monk. "I'm wet." "You're Peter," cried the abbot laughingly, as he drew him into his room and closed the door. The good lay brother, who was left on the other side of that door, shook his head in puzzlement over the strange ways of this Englishman who was his abbot. Usually dignified and calm, he was now more excited and demonstrative than a Frenchman, and toward a black Benedictine at that. No, there was no accounting for the ways of these foreigners, he thought, as he made his way back to the stables. 20 minutes later, the robes of the black Benedictine were hanging by a fire to dry, while the black Benedictine himself stood before Stephen, tugging at the folds of the white cowl they had lent him, and laughing at the thought of what the grand abbot would say if he could see his brave Cluniac at the moment. "Now you look right," said Stephen. "White suits you admirably. You should wear it always." As Peter smiled, the abbot went on. "While you were changing, Peter, I did some counting. I'm sure my figures are correct, and yet I can't believe the result. Can it be 32 years since we parted?" "Almost to the day," agreed Peter, as he took the chair Stephen had drawn up for him. "Over 3 decades of years have passed since you went your way and I went mine. And a rainstorm had to bring us together again. Had the heavens not burst asunder the way they did, I would have had to continue on to Cluny and missed the opportunity of seeing whether my quondam fellow pilgrim is as bad as people say he is. You look human, In fact, you don't look so very different from the merry young Englishman I parted from after that blessed journey to Rome." Stephen had been studying his friend as he talked. He saw what time had done to the face of the boy he had met in Burgundy that far-off day 32 years ago. Stephen had been troubled that day and lonely. Paris and its years of study lay behind him. They had been the culmination of a life devoted to learning. As a boy, he had been sent to the Benedictines at Sherborne, in England. When he finished their course of studies, he had crossed the seas to the Isle of Saints and Scholars and frequented its celebrated schools, only to end where most scholars of the day ended, at Paris. But there he had grown restless. His life seemed empty. This quest for knowledge seemed vain. He suddenly decided to quest after truth. He began by donning the pilgrim's cloak and setting his face toward Rome. He had been on the road just long enough to be desperately lonely when, passing through Burgundy, he met an attractive youth of his own age, of good education and almost his own temperament. He too was on his way to Rome, a pilgrim. Together they made the journey. That it had not been an easy one was evident from their laughing recollections of the difficult snow-covered passes of the Alps. The night they got lost and frozen in the depths of a forest. The dangerous-looking strangers who had joined them but had not robbed them. The hunger they had known before they met the warm-hearted, open-handed, ever-smiling Italians of Lombardy. "And we separated in the woods of Moulins," said Peter in conclusion. That had been their parting. For on the way back, when they came to Burgundy, Peter had pushed on to Cluny, while Stephen, attracted by what he had heard of the holiness of Robert and his revels, turned aside to join the aging giant and his handful of ex-hermits. "They tell me that old men sigh for what might have been," said Stephen. "And while we are not exactly old, we are not too young to take a quick glance at what could have been. Tell me, have you ever regretted not having taken the turn I took that day in the woods?" Peter looked at his old friend. He decided he could be as open as ever. "You're the man who should sigh for what might have been," he said. "I can't tell you the number of times I've thought how perfectly Cluny would have suited you, and how perfectly you would have suited Cluny. How often, when I'd be among the manuscripts, did I literally ache for you down among the carrots and turnips at Moulins. In all those 30-odd years, Stephen, the only moment that was not filled with regret for you was the moment I heard of your recension of the Bible. Up to that time, I could only see the burial of your talents, and I used to wonder just what the master of the house would say when he made his reckoning." Stephen smiled. "You sound just like a little imp who used to visit me daily during my first few years at Moulins. He used to say just what you've been saying. Believe me, he could quote scripture most exactly. He used to frighten me with that parable of the talents. Do you know that little imp's name?" "No." "Satan," said Stephen with a laugh. "Let me tell you, Peter, he tried me often with that temptation, couched almost in an identical words that you used." "Was it a temptation?" asked Peter with a meaningful look. Stephen studied his friend for a moment. He found him most seriously and even anxious. "I take it that you do not approve of Citeaux," he said. "Not for you, Stephen. Even though you are its abbot, you won't mind my speaking honestly. I think it was our mutual honesty that linked us so closely the year we journeyed to Rome." "Stephen, Stephen," said Peter sadly, "how is God glorified by this entombing of your brilliance? Not 10 men on the continent had your native intellectual endowment. I told you 30 years ago that you belonged in Cluny. That conviction has been deepened with the years, both by what I know of that monastery and what I have heard of this." "What do you know of this, Peter?" asked Stephen. He was sorry the conversation had taken this turn so early. He feared that it would ultimately reach this pass, but he hoped to forestall it. However, he would face the issue now. If Peter was the Peter of old, it was the only way to act. "What do I know of this place?" repeated Peter. "What everybody knows, that it is beyond nature, that it is asking for more than a man can give and more than God demands. In short, that it is fanaticism. You want me to be honest, don't you, Reverend Father?" "I do," replied Stephen. "And I don't want you to call me Reverend Father. You know my name and you know my nature. You called me the Rationalist once because I insisted on reasoning everything out so thoroughly. You meant it as a condemnation. I took it as a compliment. Whichever it was an excellent analysis. I do like to reason things out and to reason them out thoroughly. So now let us see just what there is in what everybody knows about this place." "Ah, Stephen, the world is laughing at you." "I'm glad to furnish the world with amusement," said the abbot lightly. "I know another man who was laughed to scorn once. It was just after he had worked a miracle. Perhaps you remember?" "Come, Stephen, you spoke only a moment ago of the devil quoting scripture. You know better than I that no heresiarch of the centuries, no deluded fanatic from the days before Christ down to the present day has failed to do the same. Come, face the facts. Haven't you gone too far?" "I hope not, Peter, for I haven't yet gone as far as I intend to go. There are a few things that Robert and Albrecht left for me to complete." "Robert!" snorted Peter, but then catching the fire that leapt in Stephen's eyes, he grew calmer. "A holy man in his own way, I suppose, but as steady as a weathercock. As for Albrecht—" "Still speaking from what everybody knows, I notice," interrupted Stephen quickly. He would not trust himself to listen to anything against the silver lance he had loved so well. "Let us just face the facts as you say, Peter, and let persons and personalities alone." Peter sat back in his chair and chuckled. This sudden change surprised Stephen. "What's so funny?" asked the abbot. "I am," answered Peter. "I haven't seen you in over 30 years, and yet we are not together 30 minutes when I have renewed the very argument we settled by going our separate ways 30 long years ago. Worse, I'm arguing on hearsay, as you so deftly pointed out. Forgive me, Stephen, but now I do rationalize the situation for me. I have been sorely puzzled for all of 30 years. Tell me truthfully, aren't you asking too much of human nature?" Stephen was pleased with the new tone the conversation had taken on. He loved to think, to reason, to argue, to discuss, to debate, but he detested wrangling. For a moment it had seemed that he must wrangle, but now that his friend had laughed at himself, the abbot could be freer. "I use your own criterion to answer that, Peter. Look at the facts. We've been here 12 years. Nobody has starved to death. Nobody has died from overwork or undernourishment, at least not to my knowledge," and the abbot smiled. "I have heard it said that Albrecht practically starved to death." Stephen laughed aloud. "Did you ever see the man, Peter?" The monk shook his head. "Well, even the year he died, he looked like a warrior, and not like one who was weary after a long, hard campaign, but like one in the finest fighting trim, fresh for the battle. Ah, dumb rumor has a long, long tongue and a twisted one. No, no, Peter, that's absurd. Do I look starved?" "Not at all." "And neither do any of the brethren," went on Stephen. "Benedict's allotment of 2 cooked portions, 1 pound of bread, and 3/4 of a pint of wine will not only keep body and soul together, they will keep body and soul apart. The flesh won't lust so much against the spirit if it's not overfed." "But Stephen, this is surely more than God demands." "It all depends on what you mean, Peter," said Stephen quietly. "It is true that God does not demand that we do all that is being done here at Citeaux in order that we get to heaven. But for that matter, he doesn't demand all that you are doing at Cluny either. A command is one thing, a counsel another. But if you think that we are doing more than will please God, how do you translate this? And Stephen held up a crucifix. When Peter did not answer immediately, Stephen nodded meaningfully and said, "He was left at too." The Cluniac only stirred uneasily, and Stephen went on. "There's our ultimate answer to every charge, Peter. I have heard most of them. I know we are considered fools. I know that some are saying that we have debased the meaning of the rule, the nature of man, and the dignity of the priesthood. I have heard the world laughing at what it terms our Pharisaism. But after the first sting to my natural sensitivity, it does not bother me, nor should it bother anyone who has read the gospel." "Oh, Stephen." The abbot leaned forward as if to emphasize his point. "Peter, the gospel contains the biography of a man who went about doing good. You know the reward he received for it. He was called winebibber, friend of publican and sinner. He was taunted with having a devil, decried as a violator of the law, and looked upon as mad by his own relatives. That is the man who said, 'Come, follow me.' And that is the man we are trying to follow." "And whom are we at Cluny following?" The question had come with so much fire that Stephen could not restrain his chuckle. "Let me explain," he said, and sat back. Peter stirred as if he would object, but Stephen hurried on. "The monastic world was getting soft, Peter, and it still is complacent. That is always a danger sign. History is a great teacher, and she shows that time always brings a very congenial smoothening and softening of what has come to seem harsh." Robert called these softeners mitigations. Albrecht always insisted they were compromises. But whatever their name, the facts are there. With the years, there always comes a toning down of ideals, a dilution of the uncompromising dicta of the law. They are all the more deadly because they are so perfectly prudent and utterly reasonable. Course through the history of the church, or even through the history of a single order of the church, and you will find this thing which I have called the weathering process. The years round off the rough edges and soften the hard spots. Then there comes a check. It is offered by a man who is labeled a rebel because he revolts against prevailing custom. But Peter, actually, he is the only non-rebel of his age, for he accepts uncompromisingly the naked wording of the law without so much as a sneer for contemporary opinion. Such were your early abbots, Odo, Eimard, Mayul. Such was Hildebrand. Such was Benedict of Nursia, Benedict of Anian, and every other great reformer. Such, unconsciously, was Robert of Melun. I'm becoming more and more convinced that this is not so much the work of man or of men as it is of God. It is becoming my confirmed belief that Citeaux is not only a challenge to such places as Cluny, but it is actually a check to the weathering process that has softened the entire monastic world. I haven't found it soft, Stephen, and I've lived it 30 years. It is not as hard as what you are doing here, I admit, but I don't see where it is soft. I'm talking general principles now, Peter, with only a very few specific facts. I do not mean to censure anyone, but I must tell you that the effect of the life of any reform or reformer on contemporaries is that of a dash of cold ice water on a nicely warmed back. It shocks, it shakes complacency, it stirs them to anger. That almost sounds complacent, said Peter bluntly. Sorry, said Stephen with a smile. I only mean to read a little history to you and present some present-day facts. If you mean that being an instrument of God sounds complacent, I'll tell you a truth. It makes me as complacent as the power to consecrate bread and wine makes me complacent. I don't know how you feel, but I can tell you that I never feel so small, so utterly unworthy, so crushingly humiliated, as I do when I, Stephen Harding, a sinful man, hold God in my hands. Why, Peter, every time I reflect on the power God has given me, I blush as deep as my soul. No, my friend, to be conscious of being God's instrument does not make a rational man complacent. It makes him confused and deeply, deeply humble. Before another word was said, a bell tolled vigorously. The abbot arose, smiled, and said, "Come, that's for Vespers. Stand beside me in the choir, and for once sing the praises of the Lord while robed in the white of Citeaux." It was almost an hour later that they returned to the abbot's room. Peter's face was hard. In it there was a trace of sadness. As soon as Stephen had opened the door, the visiting monk said, "It is all too true what people have been saying about you and your church, Stephen. I'm hurt, deeply hurt. I had heard that you had denuded the house of God, stripped it naked. I couldn't believe it of one of your culture, refinement, ascetic, and spiritual sense, but it is true. That's not a church. That's a bare barn." There was an angry light in Peter's eyes. The abbot noticed it and wisely refrained from comment for a space. He arranged the chairs and seated himself after gesturing to his friend. "Christ had a stable," said Stephen. "That was once too often. Why do you repeat Bethlehem? Give him the best of the earth. Nothing is too good for God. Make your church magnificent just to show him you regret the stable cave and the coldness of the Bethlehemites. Oh, I'm hurt. No wonder the world is laughing at you, or rather sneering." Stephen scratched a piece of parchment with his stylus. It was the thoughtless action of a deeply thinking man. He realized that the world had summed up his action in a neat and very expressive phrase. He had stripped his church and stripped it naked. The windows were of unstained glass. There were no statues. There was but one candlestick in the sanctuary, and that was of iron. He knew that the contrast between Cluny and Citeaux must have shocked Peter. Cluny was magnificence itself. Gold, silver, and precious stones glittered in her floor, ceiling, and walls. The sanctuary was sumptuously rich and strikingly beautiful. Even its exterior was such a work of art that Stephen predicted it would be the admiration and desperation of all succeeding ages. But what he was especially thinking of now was the shock Peter would receive in the morning. Stephen had commanded that the sacred vessels of Citeaux should be of silver gilt, that the censer be of brass, and the vestments of wool or linen. He knew the vestments and vessels to which Peter was accustomed at Cluny. They were creations of supreme art, marvels of skill and delicate workmanship. Peter had been among them for over 30 years. On the morrow he would vest in linen or wool and carry a chalice of silver gilt to the altar. Stephen thought he had better prepare him for the shock, but before he could speak, the visiting monk had leaned forward, touched him on the knee, and said, "That horror of a crucifix! Oh, Stephen, I'm hurt." "I understood your reaction, Peter," said the abbot quietly, without lifting his eyes from the parchment he was scratching. "The bareness of our little church must shock one who has been used to the opposite all his life." "But why did you do it? Why not give God all the grandeur possible?" "There's a difference between grandeur and the grandiose, Peter." "I know there is. It's the same that exists between poverty and penury, between unadorned simplicity and crude nakedness, between good taste and gaudiness. But if I have to choose, I'll prefer the overdressed to the denuded." "Did you ever look closely at a Grecian column, Peter?" "No," he answered shortly. "You'll not find it bare, though you will find it utterly unadorned. If you look closely, you'll find it chaste, simple, sublimely beautiful. And what is more, Peter, you'll find it solid enough to support substantial weight." What has a Grecian column to do with your bare church? Nothing and everything, replied Stephen slowly. You see, Peter, I was brought up with men who were somewhat given to symbolism. Robert found this in the lone star you see in the sky just after sunset or just before sunrise. There's a simplicity, a chasteness, a splendid beauty about that star, isn't there? Peter nodded, not knowing what else to do. Albric was a warrior. It is not unaccountable, then, that he should take a naked saber and a long silver lance as his symbols. For myself, I have taken the Grecian column. When Stephen paused and looked as if he would say no more, Peter again blurted, Well, what's the point? What has all this symbolism to do with your church? And above all, what has all this talk about chaste beauty to do with that horror of a painted crucifix? I had heard that you removed the corpus and painted a garish figure on the wood, but even my imagination fell far short of what you have accomplished. That's a horror. Stephen sat up. He looked at Peter a long time before he asked, Have you ever tried to picture to yourself just how Christ must have looked as he hung on the cross that awful Friday afternoon? Calvary was hideous, Peter. Christ writhed in torture. His body had to be roped lest it tear itself from the wood as it twisted and turned in agony. And after watching men die, I know that when Jesus Christ breathed his last, he was not beautiful to look upon. I have our wooden crosses painted vividly, for I want our men to realize vividly that Jesus Christ was crucified. Peter was silent. Stephen saw that the argument had struck home, and so changed his tact. What did you think of the choir? Not exactly musical, said Peter with his usual honesty, but truly fervent. Your men do not sing too well, but they pray better than any choir I have ever heard. Their voices are not the best in France by any means, but there was heart and mind behind the words. They really prayed. They truly praised God. I was edified and inspired. So the barn-like appearance of the church did not detract from their fervor, did it? Doesn't that say anything to you, Peter? We are creatures of sense. We need externals. But we are not only sense creatures. I believe in ornament, but not in ornamentation, and certainly never in ostentation. Our church may be under-decorated, but such overbalance is necessary to bring the scales back even. Is that your prime purpose? Stephen thought a moment. Then very slowly he said, No, Peter. That is not my prime purpose. In all truth, that is not my purpose at all. I was not thinking of other churches when I stripped mine naked, as you say. I was thinking only of the rule. The rule, exploded Peter. That's all, Peter, the rule. The spirit of the rule. The very first sentence on the oratory of the monastery is a veritable volume. It says, Let the oratory be what its name signifies, and let nothing else be done and nothing else be kept there. To me, that says two things very vigorously. It shouts, Be simple, be poor. That's why you find no ornamentation in our church. Simplicity and poverty demand that it be as unadorned as a Grecian column. Poverty will not allow for silver, gold, or precious stones. Simplicity will not allow for storied stained glass, nor for vessels or vestments that delight the connoisseur of art. It was the rule that moved me. Peter smiled. It strikes me as strange to hear anyone at Citeaux speak of the spirit of the rule. For over 10 years now, the world has been laughing at this place and calling you Pharisees, because you have been so taken up with the letter of the rule that you seem to ignore its spirit. Stephen joined him in a smile. I know it, he said, but the world has not yet caught the spirit of Citeaux. Then, leaning toward his friend, he continued, Peter, long before Citeaux was founded, long before Molem was founded, yes, even before Robert had been sent to Cologne, the ideal you now see nearing realization has been conceived. From the day the chaste evening star appealed to Robert as his symbol, poverty and simplicity have been the ideal toward which he and all his followers have worked. I am but doing what Robert and Albrecht would have done had God given them time. There is nothing in the church now but what is chaste, simple, necessary, and poor. I know that Robert jolted the monastic world with his rigor for the rule. I know that Albrecht, with his spirit of no compromise, shook the world. But despite what the world says or thinks, as long as the rule calls for simplicity and poverty, everything about Citeaux is going to be both simple and poor. We've gone back to the letter to catch the spirit. We are now almost all the way back. Almost? Questioned Peter with a laugh. It seems to me you're already further than back. You're quite a good way beyond. But Stephen, I must admit that this visit and this talk have opened my eyes. I see your ideal. You certainly are realizing it. I can't say that I sympathize with the ideal as yet, but I do say that the world has laughed too loud and too long. You are the same old rationalist, and you have very sound reasons for what appeared most irrational. Forgive me for my seeming censoriousness. But believe me when I tell you that this is like being in another world. You can't imagine how bare and cold this place seems after Cluny. When I make my next move, it will seem even barer and colder. Peter looked at his friend quizzically. Are you deliberately setting out to stagger the world, Stephen? What is your next move? If I read Benedict's rule aright, he wanted his monks to be cenobites, but at the same time, he wanted his monasteries to be solitude. Again, I am aiming at the spirit. Yes, and you are hinting at something I don't quite catch. Well, began Stephen, when Benedict expressly states that a monastery should contain within itself water, a mill, a bakehouse, a garden, and the various workshops, and then immediately adds, thus eliminating the necessity for the monks to go abroad, I hear him crying more than, monks stay in. I very distinctly hear him commanding, world, stay out. In other words, Peter, the third star in the Cistercian firmament is solitude. Now you have the complete ideal of Citeaux: simplicity, poverty, and solitude. Go on, elucidate, commanded Peter, who was all attention. You visited monasteries, Peter. Didn't you find them little different from feudal castles? Weren't they noisy with the horses of knights, the carriages of nobles, and the bickerings of serfs? Some are, admitted Peter, but I fail to see even a remote danger of this swampland becoming feudal territory or this little monastery a castle. No, as long as poverty and simplicity hold forth, but its solitude can be destroyed. The Duke of Burgundy has been very good to us. Much to the chagrin of many a monk, laughed Peter. They say Hugh is just as friendly and as generous as was his father. And just as pious, admitted Stephen in a tone of voice that brought Peter's eyebrows up. Stephen smiled. You saw that mansion down the lane, the monk nodded. Odo built that for himself and his suite. He never missed a feast day. He'd come on the vigil and leave after vespers. His son has done the same. I'm going to put a ban on such visits. What? Shouted Peter as he rose partly out of his chair. Great heavens, man, where's your gratitude, your prudence, your respect for nobility, your zest for the honor of God, your... That's enough, cried Stephen laughingly as he held up a restraining hand. And that is mild to what the world will say. But Stephen, you're mad. What do you mean by such a thing? Without solitude, there is no real recollection. Without real recollection, there is no true prayer. Without true prayer, we are eggshells, empty eggshells. But the nobility come only on feast days, Stephen. Surely your community can stand that little distraction. You never met the Silver Lance, Peter, or you'd never talk that way. He had one cry, No compromise. But how dare you take the gifts and ban the giver? Odo built this monastery and maintained it for years. He was the real founder, Robert. He was the real founder. Robert was only the monastic head. And now you ban his heir from the house his father built? You don't know all that Odo did for us, Peter, agreed Stephen. We were putting up a fight when he came along. He sent men and materials, and the monastery went up. That was only the beginning. He donated pasture lands and set herds grazing over them. He set up granges and staffed them with serfs. He presented us with choice vineyards and gave us the most skilled of his workmen to care for them. Why, over half of our lay brothers were the Duke's vassals. He loved this place as a mother loved an afflicted child. He lies out there buried among the brethren, for he really was their father. His son, Duke Hugh, has followed in his father's footsteps. He is our powerful protector and our very generous friend. And yet before the week is out, I'm going to tell him that he can no longer come with his retinue to celebrate feasts here. But why? Cried the excited Peter. This is the maddest thing I've ever heard. You're abolishing a privilege that is centuries old. You're insulting nobility. You are biting the hand that has fed you, Stephen. Stephen, what means this madness? The abbot's smile was a little grim as he answered, It means I'm completing the rebellion Robert began. It means I'm being rational enough to be as radical as was Albrecht. It means that the purity of the rule, letter and spirit, will be the boast of Citeaux. Peter shook his head sadly. It means that you're going to bring the whole monastic world and the whole world of Burgundian nobility swarming around your head like angry hornets. No, no, Stephen, the rule does not call for this mad measure. Peter, said the abbot very seriously, you have outlined what I have already foreseen. The only one who will not be offended is the man you'd expect to be offended the most. I'm expecting Duke Hugh to understand. I could tell you a long story about the tiny germs of worldliness that creep into a monastic heart and gnaw away silently till its very substance is gone. But I won't. I could tell you the effect atmosphere, environment, weathering have on everything in creation, even the monastic heart, but I won't. I could tell you of the veritable army of distractions that come from a mere glimpse at the pomp, the parade, the color, and show inseparable from a duke and his escort, but I won't. I'm simply going to ask you to read that passage of the rule I quoted a while ago. Then ask yourself if Saint Benedict is not shouting, let there be complete separation from the world, let there be strict cloister, but no women come. Ah, Peter, that's what I call being literal-minded. That's the purest of pure Pharisaism. Cloister does not mean women stay out. It means world stay out. And let me tell you, Citeaux is going to be cloistered. It's unnecessary, Stephen, was Peter's final comment. Totally unnecessary. You're going beyond the rigor of the rule. You're going against moderation, gratitude, reverence. Don't you really think many overstress moderation, Peter? Look, he said and held up the crucifix. Not much moderation there, is there? Although Christ could have redeemed the world with a drop of his precious blood, he drained himself. And yet there are Christians who will cry, moderation! It has always struck me that they are most immoderate in their insistence on moderation. All your arguments end with Christ and the crucifix, I notice. Your eyesight is poor, Peter. They all begin there. Benedict said, let nothing be preferred to the love of Christ. The monk was not impressed. He sat there shaking his head. Finally, he looked up and asked, have you counted the full cost, Stephen? To the last sou, cried the abbot, and I'm going to pay it. This move will cap the climax, interjected Peter. White habits, sparse diet, labor like serfs, letter of the rule, denuded church, and now the banning of nobility. You are certainly furnishing the world with a lot of surprise. You're complimenting the wrong man, Peter, smiled the abbot. Pay your tribute to Benedict of Nursia. I'm only following his rule. And what am I following? The abbot arose. That last bell we heard was a summons to the reading before night prayer. Sit beside me in your flowing white robes, and during your meditation tomorrow morning, answer your own question. 3 Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 2. This chapter is entitled, Stephen Furnishes Heaven with a Problem. Peter put on his black habit the next morning. He felt better. As he stood with one foot in the stirrup, ready to vault into the saddle, he turned to Stephen. I'm glad it rained, Stephen. I'm glad I got soaked. This visit has been a blessing in more ways than one. I understand Cito a bit. As he swung up into the saddle, his horse pranced a little. Peter reined him in, looked down on the abbot, and laughed. But I'm glad I'm heading for home. You don't like Cito? Asked Stephen. I didn't say that, replied Peter as his horse sidestepped a pace. But I do say that I love Cluny. My parting shot, Stephen, is this. You've justified everything about the place, even that denuded church. You're still a rationalist. But don't be irrational enough to ban the Duke. Stephen laughed, raised his hand in blessing, and said, I hope the clouds burst soon again. You're old enough now to know that you should come in out of the rain. Give the Grand Abbot my sincerest sentiments of esteem and my warmest affection. Tell him we are not condemning Cluny, for just as in my Father's house there are many mansions, so on earth there must be many monasteries. Then beg him not to be too shocked when I ban the Duke. You're going to do it? I'm going to do it, answered Stephen with a resolute nod of the head. For good or ill, you're a man who knows his own mind, Peter answered with a smile. As he looked down on the abbot, he continued, Our pilgrimage to the eternal city was made together, Stephen. Our pilgrimage to the city of eternity is being made. Together in spirit, broke in Stephen. It's the same God we worship. It's the same home for which we are heading. Peter, I'm very grateful to God for allowing you to spend the night with us. Pray for me when I ban the Duke. Then spend the night that follows with me in spirit, for I'm quite sure it will be very black. But simplicity, poverty, and solitude must shine at Cito like stars in the midnight heaven. You're stubborn, Stephen, chuckled Peter, but I'll be with you. Then as he put spurs to his horse, he traced the sign of the cross over the head of the abbot of Cito. Before the week was out, Stephen had talked to the Duke. The Duke listened as sympathetically as he could. He tried hard to understand the abbot. His only fear was that he or his men had given some offense. Reassured on this point again and again, he gave fuller mind to what Stephen had to say. When told of the high aim of the contemplative, intimate union with God, he understood Stephen's zeal for solitude. Before the conference ended, it was made clear to Hugh that he would be welcome always as a visitor, that the rule provided explicitly for guests. But what the rule did not provide for was the noise and bustle of a large gathering and the distraction inseparable from the colorful retinue of a duke. Hugh admitted the principle and accepted its application. He warned Stephen, however, of two things. First, that he was inviting sharp criticism even from those who had heretofore been sympathetic, and second, that he would alienate the nobility. He went further and pointed out that Cito had retained just as much land as she could cultivate herself. She had refused all other sources of revenues. She had cut herself off from what all others considered legitimate sources of income. She insisted on being self-supporting. What now if there should come a rainy day? Just as a person needs friends, so does a monastery, he warned. The abbot replied that he had weighed all that, but he was ready to hazard everything so long as the Duke was not offended. He even admitted that it was not prudent policy to attack long-standing custom as he was attacking it, but he insisted that principle would allow of no other course. Hugh bowed before the abbot's decision. Before the next feast, he told his intimates that they could no longer celebrate the solemnities of the abbey. When he gave the reason, angry fires of indignation were kindled, which soon burned away all friendship for the little monastery in the swampland. Peter had predicted what Stephen would bring, a swarm of hornets buzzing around his head. But Peter proved a false prophet. There was much buzzing, and it was done by nobles and monks who were as mad as hornets, but they did not buzz about Citeaux. No, that little monastery was left severely alone. The nobles shunned it as resolutely as a burnt child shuns the fire. But this isolation did not immediately produce anything save joy for those in the swampland. When the Duke had so royally accepted the situation, Stephen felt that the rebellion was at last complete. Mitigations were gone, all compromise had been cut away. Citeaux was supporting herself by the labor of her hands. Simplicity shone in her office, her mass, and in her entire monastery. Poverty reigned supreme, and solitude was at last assured. If ever a man had perfect surroundings in which to live with and to God alone, that man, thought Stephen, was the monk of Citeaux. The place now, with the world locked out and the monk locked in, was a veritable paradise of prayer, while the nature of the terrain, with its woods and swamps and soggy undergrowth, made it a real purgatory for penance. A monk had to labor if he would live. Before July had burned herself into August, however, Stephen was frowning. His monks may have been free from distraction. He had provided for that by banning the Duke, but he himself was far from free. And day by day he grew more and more distracted. For July was really burning into August, and even clammy, swampy, ever-wet Citeaux was dry. Vegetables do not grow in dust. The abbot began to fear for his harvest. By the end of September, his worst fears were realized. There was no harvest. Soon it was evident that even the sparse diet prescribed by Saint Benedict could not be provided for the little band lost in the woods. So before the leaves had fallen and November had grown gray, Stephen, who had locked out the world, had to go out into that world and beg. From castle to castle he went, and while he was received with reverence, he was not welcomed with warmth. Nobility had been outraged by his act. Most gave him something, but they very persuasively pointed out that the summer's drought had been universal. Stephen accepted the little with gratitude and went away as he had come, with a smile. There was much derisive laughter over the abbot and his smile. Nobles and monks who had long predicted Citeaux's demise were having their hour of triumph. It was only a matter of time now until their prophecy would be exactly fulfilled. The 12th century was the 12th and not the 6th. In it, St. Benedict's rule had to be interpreted, not read literally. Citeaux would soon be a swamp again. So they talked. But exult as they would, they could never free themselves from an element of puzzlement and doubt that was produced by that unfailing smile on the thin and worn face of the abbot. But a greater puzzle existed for those simple souls who had watched the growth of the abbey and marveled at the zeal of her monks. Here were men who had done all that it was humanly possible for a person to do in order to glorify God in the most generous way. Here were men who had risen above the mediocrity of the world around them and the sluggishness that lies deep in every human soul. Here were men who had battled their way up to the very heights of heroic Christian living. men who had brought chivalry and gallantry within cloister walls, men who had flung themselves down before God, a holocaust, and their immediate reward was affliction. These sincere, simple souls were more than puzzled by Stephen's smile. They were shocked by it. How dare a man smile in the face of such trouble? But they never knew the secret source of that tranquility, for they never knew the abbot's deep devotion to the Mother of God. From her he had learned her whole story, how, after answering the angel's salutation with a whole-souled, generous fiat, she immediately became the mother of sorrows. That had been a life lesson for Stephen. He used to go over and over the facts he had learned at his lady's knee. How, when her child was ready to be brought forth, she was hurried from her home to a town of crowded inns and closed doors. How she had scarcely given birth to the world's Savior when she was driven across desert sands and forced to dwell among the swarming gods by the teeming Nile. How she lost him at the age of 12. At 30 he left her, and at 33 she held him, blood-clotted and cold, outside the temple-crowned city and the home of his chosen people. It was at Mary's knee that Stephen had learned how to say fiat, how to suffer and how to smile. But there was another lesson he had also learned from Mary. He had watched her at a wedding feast and saw how she presented facts to her son and demanded the miraculous. Stephen would be like her in this also. He would present heaven with a problem. If water could be changed to wine just to save a young couple from embarrassment, surely 3 sous could be changed to something worthwhile for a starving community. So just before the snows of winter, when he heard that there was to be a fair at Vézelay, he called an obedient monk to his side and said, "I have scoured the house. This is all the ready cash I could find." The monk held out his hand. Into it, Stephen placed 3 little sous. When the monk looked up, Stephen said, "Go into Vézelay. There is a fair there. Buy 3 wagons. For each wagon, buy 3 horses. Then load those wagons with clothes, food, and all the things we need. Come back to us then in prosperity and joy." The monk gazed down at his hand. The 3 sous looked unbelievably small. Then he looked up at his abbot. Stephen was smiling. The monk did not answer that smile. He looked down at his hand again. Then Stephen laughed aloud, took the monk by the arm, walked him to the gate, and with the tiniest shove said, "Go, God will provide." The monk went. Naturally, he was puzzled, very puzzled. As he walked along, the suspicion grew that perhaps hunger had addled his abbot's brain. But he kept on his way, for obedience becomes instinctive with a thorough rebellious. But often along the road, he took out those 3 little sous, stared at them, shook his head, looked to the skies and sighed. "Lord, you'll have to provide a lot. 3 wagons, 9 horses, all the clothes and food we need, and all for 3 sous. Oh." When he arrived at Vézelay, he put his hand into his pocket to be sure that the 3 little sous were there. He found them. They seemed to reassure him. Then he did the natural thing. He sought out a friend to tell the whole sad story and to get his sympathy. He found the house, entered, took out the 3 sous and said, "Look at what I've got to get all that Citeaux needs." Then, with a meaningful nod of the head toward the little sous in the outstretched palm of his hand, he told his friend the whole story. Just as he finished, his friend slapped his thigh, rose with a sudden spring, grasped the forlorn monk by the arm, and excitedly cried, "Come. I know the man who must see your sous and hear your story. Come." Out of the house they went, the friend dragging the monk along behind him, down the street, across a wide lawn, and into a great mansion. Here, with very little ceremony, the friend hurried the monk to the bedside of a very sick man. The story was briefly told. The sick man heard it, raised himself on his elbow, and in a weak, cracked voice called to his wife, "Give this monk every sou he needs. Citeaux shall have her wagons, horses, and all she needs." Then as he sank back on the pillow, he gasped, "Tell them to pray for me." Next day, Stephen and the community were out in procession to meet the man who had still the 3 sous, but who was leading back 3 wagons, each with its 3 horses and each piled high with the things the Citeaux needed. As he handed the sous to the abbot, he smiled and said, "God provided, but I certainly was scared." Stephen only smiled. He saw that Mary had not forgotten how to get favors from her son. But those 3 wagon loads only took the community through the winter. As March winds began to blow, sickness struck. Plague was stalking the land in the wake of famine. Citeaux was not passed by. Then for the first time in 30-odd years, Stephen's smile vanished. Hunger and real want never shook his confidence, but death did. Into those usually clear eyes, clouding uneasiness came, and on that usually placid brow there appeared a frown as the grim specter, with merciless regularity, walked into the church and emptied stall after stall. Recruits had never been plentiful. Not all who came had stayed. After the banning of the Duke, they stopped coming altogether. In church, Stephen had to look at the ever-shortening line of the choir and listen to the ever-thinning volume of song. He grew deeply troubled. Week after week, he had to kneel at newer graves. The crosses kept thickening in the graveyard, and the troubled abbot began to suspect that soon Citeaux would be but a haunted house with a crowded cemetery. Were the critics right? Had he and Albrecht and Robert gone too far, demanded too much? Was he entirely mistaken in the newly born belief that they had been raised up to shock the complacency of the monastic world of the day? Had 6 centuries so changed men that Benedict's rule could not be observed? Was God himself displeased with the presumption of Citeaux? If not, what meant these 13 years of comparative barrenness and this devastating mortality now? The furrows deepened and the clouds of doubt grew thicker. He remembered what Robert had said about the evening star, his evening star, so solitary and alone. "Others come out after it," he had said, "but before they do, we will have to see the dark." "Oh God," cried Stephen, "it is dark now, pitch dark." And even while he cried, there came to the hollow, chilling sound of that loud wooden tablet that told of death striking again. "Oh dear God," groaned Stephen, "it's growing darker. It's time to do the daring, it's time to do the desperate thing." With that resolution firmly fixed, Stephen went to the deathbed. Then, in a silence that was nerve-shattering, he gave a command that struck fear in the heart of the boldest. "Brother Felix," he said, "by virtue of your obedience, I command you to return to us after your death with information concerning our state of life, telling whether it be pleasing to God or no." The monk died. A few days passed and nothing happened. Then Stephen began to grow frightened. Had he been too daring? Had he been presumptuous in thus presenting heaven with his problem? But what could he do? It had grown so dark. He had to do it. His horizons had all gone black. He had to send someone to the source of all light. Then one day, when all were working in the fields, and Stephen was at their head, he gave the signal for their usual short rest in the middle of the work period. Walking to one side where he could be alone, he suddenly found himself in a blaze of light. Startled, he lifted his head and looked directly into the eyes of Felix, the brother he had commanded to come back from the dead. Stephen gasped and fell on his knees, but Felix only smiled and said, Lay aside all doubt, Reverend Father, and hold for certain that your manner of life is holy and very, very pleasing to God. Furthermore, your grief at your want of children will soon disappear, for many will come to you, men of noble birth and learning. Yes, and like bees swarming in haste and overflowing the hive, they shall fly away and spread themselves throughout many lands. Stephen smiled his old radiant smile. Furrows faded from his brow and clouds disappeared from his eyes. He looked like the young, eager Stephen who had listened to Albrecht talking about Crusader sons with the Crusader spirit. He looked even younger. He looked like the mere boy who had stared at the evening star and heard Robert's prediction about other stars coming out after dark. Then his hand came up, and striking his breast, he breathed, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Forgive me, Lord." That same evening he stood at his window and watched the sky. When the west was white, he saw the brilliant silver radiance of Vesper, all beautiful but all alone. He stood at that window and kept staring into that sky. The dark came slowly that evening. It came subtly, imperceptibly. In the more distant and deeper blue, Stephen saw tiny silver anemones break through and flower in five-petaled loveliness. It was long years since he had watched the blooming of the sapphire skies. He felt that he was seeing it now for the first time, and he found himself softly singing, "It is the glory of God that the heavens tell." Mist rose before him, and through his tears he saw shimmering silver grandeur. Robert was right. Stars do come out after dark. Many stars, he thought. Then with lifted face he prayed, "But dear Lord, it has been so dark, so pitch dark, and I have been so alone. Robert went, Albrecht died, we lost our benefactors, poverty came, then want, beggary, hunger. Suffering was followed by sickness, then death. It was pitch black, dear Lord. There were no stars, but I should not have faltered. Forgive me my weak faith. I know now that it is only after dark that stars come out." Next day, Stephen was in a far corner of the little cemetery, standing by Albrecht's grave. The leaf of his life fell, he thought, and when it fell, it was flaming red. Many, very many have fallen since. The ground around me is covered. Thank God they too were scarlet when they fell, all changed, all beautiful. But the tree whence they fell became more bare, and I grew frightened. Winter had come. Albrecht spoke of the Crusader spirit. They had it, these few, but most had fallen. The shields for the Sacred Heart lay battered and broken, and there were no strong arms to snatch them up. But spring is here now. The ground grows softer around his grave. The tree whence fell his scarlet leaf is shooting with tiny green tips. The woodland breeze grows warmer, and hope, the hope of younger years, comes warm again to my heart. I miss him, that old Silverlance, but when I stand here, he seems close to us, and he brings me strength. I must complete his work. God has said that men will come. I have no doubt that they will be what Albrecht promised and prophesied, Crusader sons with a Crusader spirit. Then he knelt and prayed from the inmost core of his being. Dear God, grant that those who do come grow as this man grew, strong, straight, and true. And when it comes time for them to fall, let them fall as he fell. Let them fall as flame. Naturally, the message Felix had given him the day in the fields filled Stephen's mind. He went over it again and again. Men of noble birth and learning, he had said. Stephen loved that first word, men. Yes, he wanted men, for only real men would stay and live the life of Citeaux. It was a rugged world, this little monastery in the swampland, and in it there was no room for the effeminate or the weak. It was a world that demanded passion, but had no time for sentimentality. It was a world that challenged the depths of man and called forth his highest vigor and bravery. That was why Stephen loved the first word of the message, for he well knew that the virile can be brought to high virtue and the strong to towering sanctity. He thanked God for the first word with its latent promise of strong, virile, vigorous men. The qualifications Felix had added set Stephen dreaming. Men of noble birth, he had said. Stephen recalled a remark he had made to Robert years before. They had been discussing Albrecht and the secrecy about his lineage. Stephen had laughed at his abbot and said, "Even if Albrecht is sprung from the lowliest of serfs, he is still a nobleman." Stephen did not care so much whence men came. He cared a great deal about what they were. Then he reflected that his often used illustration worked all ways. Good atmosphere and environment weather a soul and shape a character, just as an atmosphere that is tainted and an environment that is evil can soil the purest and warp the stoutest. Gradually, that first qualification made some appeal to Stephen. Noblesse oblige spurred knights to magnificent daring and immortal doings in the world. Why then could it not send souls of nobles scaling sanctity's topmost heights from within the lowly cloister? The argument seemed sound, and slowly Stephen grew fond of this first qualification. But the second held no immediate appeal. Men of learning. Of what use was learning in a world such as Citeaux, where from foundation stone to cornice the substance was simplicity? Of what use was learning to men whose one work was to praise God in the Psalms of David and to humble themselves as serfs sweating in the soil? Of what use was learning in a world where the only science was the science of the saints? Stephen frowned over the qualification. What did it mean? He himself was accounted a man of learning. He had spent all the years of his youth in school, first those of England, then those of Ireland, and finally those of France. And yet he felt he had never been to a real school until he entered the abbey at Melun, and endeavored to forget the learning he had acquired as he bent all his attention to learning how to walk in the footsteps of the Nazarene. Of what use was learning to a lowly monk? But then Stephen stopped frowning and opened his eyes in wide surprise at himself. What was coming over him? Was the weathering process taking effect on himself? Was he being conquered by environment and made subject to suggestion? Was the oft-repeated but untrue cliché that learning is no aid to sanctity working its way into his subconsciousness? He sat down at his desk to reason out the problem. It was true that God is charity, but the God-man did not so characterize himself. His words were, "I am the truth." Christ said he was the truth. That is also true of the Godhead. God is substantial truth. It must follow then, argued Stephen, that every tiny truth firmly grasped, no matter in what order, is really getting a firmer, fuller grasp on God. And that is why a monk lives. He wants to grasp God. His life is nothing but groping, a continual groping after God. Eternity will be the everlasting embrace of him he longed to hold. Everything then, from the abstract mathematical truth that 2 and 2 make 4, up to and including the subtlest, purest, and most refined of metaphysical notions contained in the concept of God's essence, must be interrelated. Hence, they are manifestations of the being we love and adore. Therefore, the sharper the intellect, the keener the ultimate sanctity. That would be a truer saying than learning is no aid to sanctity, said Stephen aloud. But true rationalist that he was, Stephen paused and asked, true in the speculative how about the practical order? But true rationalist that he was, Stephen paused and asked, true in the speculative, how about the practical order? How has my education helped me in my striving after sanctity? He had not reflected long when a wide smile lit his countenance. for he saw that it had helped and helped immensely. Further, he saw that it always would help. For the more vivid the fancy, the more lively the imagination, the keener and quicker the perception, the firmer and fuller would be the grasp on truth. Stephen was really thinking now. God is not grasped by hands, he argued. He is not folded into one's breast and hugged by arms of flesh. No, he is spirit, and can only be held by the Spirit. That is why the intellect is of such paramount importance in the spiritual life. Sanctity is a product of the head and heart, not of the heart alone. Stephen drew his chair in to his desk. This subject deserved attention. He had never realized how important the intellect was, but now he saw that the will was a blind man who was led along by the one faculty of the soul that could see. Love is the result of knowledge, he reflected. Then he thought of faith and grew enthusiastic as he defined it as an intellectual assent, not a palpitation of the heart or a surge of the feelings. It is the mind that matters, he almost cried, for it is the mind that acts as helmsman for the monk, steering him between the whirlpool and the rock, keeping him from the Scylla of mere pictistic mouthings and sentimental effusions of feelings, as well as from the charybdis of callous, cold, mechanical performance of duty. A monk must not be a stoic nor a gushing geyser. He must be a rational being. Mind must be his mentor. Indeed it must, for faith, hope, and charity depend on the faculty that knows. Stephen sat back and shook his head in hearty agreement. He saw now why some souls were abashed as they entered the religious life and began their quest for intimacy with God. Their wills were right. They longed after the divinity. They wanted to grasp him and hold him to their hearts. But their minds were wrong. They were not men of learning. They thought that some infinite abyss yawned between them and the one who made them and saved them. They had never grasped the relation of all things to the Absolute. They had never known that the way to God is the wide open way of the universe, and that no matter where they stood and no matter how they turned, their first step could be a step toward God. That's the truth, mused Stephen. They were not men of learning. Hence, they did not know how to read the signposts that a provident God had set up all along the way. They had never learned that every creature, from a tiny violet nodding in the breeze to those mighty silver spears whirling through the stretches of the skies, is an index pointing directly to God. What a subtle heresy is abroad in the world of religious, exclaimed Stephen. Too many are confusing simplicity with stupidity. They are looking on science as an enemy to sanctity. They firmly believe that an intellectual person cannot be humble. Then the abbot smiled. If it weren't so tragic, it would be amusing. I wonder what they think Christ's intellect was like. They cannot deny he was humble. From that day on, the entire message of Felix pleased Stephen greatly, but it also stirred his impatience. He smiled and prayed much those days, and his greatest prayer was for patience. For after reasoning long on each phrase in the message, he had concluded that every qualification had place at Citeaux. And since he had the assurance that his manner of life was pleasing to God, his only remaining problem was how to hold himself in calmness until heaven would fulfill the promise it had made. That problem he also presented to heaven. Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 3. This chapter is entitled, Heaven Furnishes Stephen with a Problem. The Lenten fast was over. Stephen and his handful had sung the first glorious Alleluias of Easter and were exulting with the triumphantly risen Christ. Their band was small now, smaller than it had ever been. But the air of glad expectancy that had filled Citeaux the day Stephen had his visit from Felix still lifted every heart in the monastery. They, too, prayed for patience, even as had their abbot. But each succeeding day, full of bright hope though it was, wore their patience thinner and thinner. The austerities of the season of special penance had not robbed their expectancy of its edge. But with the dawn of Easter, a new calm seemed to settle on all, even on the abbot. One afternoon, not long after that first glad Alleluia had burst from their joyous throats, Stephen was at his desk studying the recension he had made of the Bible. He was deep in his work when there came a sharp, nervous knock on his door, and the breathless porter burst in with the shout, "They have come!" The abbot looked up. He had been far away in his thoughts. "Who?" he asked calmly. "The men of noble birth and learning." The book fell from Stephen's hands. He felt his pulse quicken. "How many?" he asked. 32, cried the excited porter. Stephen walked to the gate as calmly as he could, but the effort was noticeable. Color glowed in his usually pale cheeks, while his eyes were unnaturally bright and sparkling. The porter swung the door open, and 32 noblemen saw a stately abbot step into the frame and smile. It was all that Stephen could do at the moment. Before him stood nobles ranging from the tender age of 13 to that of over 50 years. Stephen saw them through a tremulous mist. Tears of joy refused to be stemmed. With wonder, he learned that these men were all knitted by the ties of blood and intimate friendship. Their spokesman was a handsome, light-haired, large-eyed, trimly built lad of 22. His name was Bernard. He had come from Fontaine. He was scion of one of Burgundy's best families. Behind him stood 4 of his brothers, one of his uncles, some of his cousins, and many of his lifelong friends. The one question he asked was, "May we come in?" Stephen blinked. Could they come in? Ah, if only he were French, he could answer that with an effusion. Could they come in? For years he had been waiting and praying. For weeks he had been watching. And today, could they come in? Stephen was sorry he was not French. He wanted to be voluble. He wanted to make expressive gestures and have a flood of warm words flow from his lips. They were all there in his heart. But all he could do was smile and say, "Yes, come in. But this one? No, I fear he is too young." He touched Bernard's young cousin, Robert. The lad was only 13. Many things happened to Stephen Harding's heart that afternoon in Eastertide when he stood framed in the doorway greeting Bernard with his band. It responded to the freshness and warm appeal of youth, the dignity of sober, steadfast, middle-aged, and the gray hairs of warrior Gauldry, Bernard's maternal uncle. Most of all, it was overwhelmed with the fidelity and goodness of God. That night, he tried to appreciate what had happened. It was difficult. What a band of novices had come. Knights had laid aside sword and spear. Nobles had left wives and children. Youth had left life, adventure, romance in the world, and all had come to little Citeaux to seek God alone. From that day, Citeaux changed. New life pulsed in her veins. A more vibrant tempo beat in her choral song, and a younger heart throbbed at her manual labor. And from that day, Citeaux's abbot changed. He grew young again. A happier light came into his eyes, a more musical ring to his voice, and a greater spring to his step. It was then that Stephen began his greatest work, the molding of the greatest man of the 12th century and the greatest glory of Citeaux, young Bernard of Fontaine. He had sensed that fact the moment his porter had opened the door, and he had heard the light voice of the young Burgundian noble. He had sensed it with a touch of fright, but it was a challenge to his manhood, a stimulus that made him seek out God the Father for strength, God the Son for wisdom, and God the Holy Spirit for light. Springtime filled the woodlands and the heart of Stephen of Citeaux. He walked to the cemetery morning after morning to bring Albrecht news of the hoped-for men of nobility and learning who had come to them. He told the Silver Lance that some of them were crusaders' sons, and that all of them had the crusader spirit. Told him how he must now set to work teaching them to make God the focal point of their thoughts and affections. With a smile, he used the phrase so dear to Robert and Albrecht, God-oriented. With God's help, he would do that. He would orientate these men. It was not the difficult task he expected, for he soon saw that their environment and education had worked on their souls. Before the month was out, Stephen had learned how much a mother can do to the mind and heart of children. Secretly, the abbot admitted that Alice of Montbar, wife to Tescelin of Fontaine, and mother of Bernard and his brothers, had been master of novices for this select group. But Stephen was wise enough to realize that heaven had furnished him with a problem. He knew that these men would be tempted. He knew that the lowly life at Citeaux would not be easy for Gaudry, the knight and noble who had left castle, vassals, and wealth. No, it would not be easy for him to take orders and work like a serf. Nor would it be easy for Guy, Bernard's eldest brother, who had left wife and 2 charming baby girls. It would not be easy for him to live alone in silence. Nor would it be easy for Bernard's other brothers, Gerard and Andrew. They had been knighted and had already tasted the heady wine of triumph in battle. Indeed, it would be difficult for such men to rest satisfied with the dull, prosaic life of following a plow. And so for the rest of the 30, it would not be easy. But Stephen must find a way to make it less hard. And he did. He found the only way. He found him who said of himself, "I am the way." How Stephen's solution worked is the fascinating story of The Family That Overtook Christ, a continuation of this saga of Citeaux. Here it is enough to say that Stephen presented his solution clearly. What he especially impressed on them was the fact that Christ was a man. Hence, they were to take for their motto, act manfully. Do everything for God in a virile way. That would be the Christ way. For practical purposes, he brought it down to do well what you are doing. Be intent on the task of the moment. Bend heart and mind and all your energies on that one thing to the utter exclusion of everything else. It was a simple lesson, and one that was easily learned, for it was thoroughly taught, and these men, most of whom had spent their lives in the saddle with a mettlesome charger between their knees and a spear or mace in their hands, took the lesson Stephen taught them and twisted it into a battle cry. They used it the rest of their lives. It steadied them when they were wavering. It spurred them on when their energies flagged. It blew the fire in their souls to brilliant flame when they needed flame. It was all for God. When Stephen saw how quickly they grasped the lesson and caught the spirit of Citeaux, when he saw how in one lightning sword thrust they had pierced to the very heart of St. Benedict's rule, he knelt down humbly and from a grateful heart poured out fervent thanks to God for having sent men, real men, men of nobility and learning. But that was only the beginning of the problem heaven had presented for Bernard of Fontaine, for Bernard of Fontaine had started something. When Burgundy learned that the Lord of Fontaine was alone in his castle with his only daughter and his youngest son, there was a mighty stirring. Tournaments still went on, and young nobles were knighted, but the attention of the duchy was not on these things alone. The air became alive with talk of the abbey lost in the swampland. The leading topic of conversation was neither the latest champion of the tourneys, nor the fairest lady. It was Bernard, his band, and little Citeaux. Day after day, knighthood grew more and more conscious of a higher chivalry, and courtiers learned that there was a place for them behind cloister walls. At the moment, the soldiers of the duchy were laying siege to Grancy, but even this was no deterrent to nobles who had caught the spark from Bernard, to knights who had been stirred by young Andrew, nor to older warriors who knew Guy and Gaudry. There were many heated arguments. Charges of desertion and fanaticism were leveled against those who would imitate the men of Fontaine. But despite the sting of taunts and the ridicule of the unheeding, old and young kept going to Citeaux. Week after week, the iron knocker on the abbey gate was lifted and resolutely banged by men who were used to battle and who were ready to fight. Week after week, Stephen Harding welcomed new novices and found among them crusader sons ablaze with the crusader spirit. Week after week, he welcomed not only men of nobility and learning, but also ignorant men, men of the soil and serfdom. Both he welcomed equally. Abbot Stephen could hardly believe it. He saw his problem grow, but he was not afraid. He would find a solution in time. At the moment, he was satisfied to be humbled, and more than once he walked to the cemetery to tell Albrecht and the others of the wonder that was taking place, and to beat his breast as he said, "And to think I actually doubted." But beating the breast was not enough when the influx continued and little Citeaux became overcrowded. What should he do? Was this sudden flow after the long years of drought a mere spring freshet? Would it stop with the summer? Should he enlarge the abbey? Would the postulants stay? These were some of the questions that turned in Stephen's mind as he paced the cemetery paths. He remembered that it was here, on these very paths, that he had first been startled by the realization that Robert and Albrecht had really created something distinct. It was here, on these very paths, that Stephen decided to complete that creation. He would not enlarge the abbey. He would enlarge the order. Yes, he said, pacing more rapidly. Order it is going to be. He had seen it coming before Albrecht died. It is true that he had doubted when death had emptied stall after stall with chilling regularity, and the iron knocker on the abbey gate was silent. But that was his sin. He was making reparation for it now. He talked earnestly to the dead as he paced the paths, and he heard the dead talking to him. He talked to the lay brothers who had so edified him and encouraged him. He talked to the men who had died under him as abbot. Finally, he talked long with Brother Felix, the man he had commanded to come back from the dead, and who had come back. He said, "The applicants are like bees swarming, Felix. It is time for some to fly away and spread themselves to other parts." With Stephen, to think had ever been to act. He had reasoned the situation out thoroughly. He had arrived at his conclusion. So one morning in the early May of 1113, when the grass was thick and very green in the mounded cemetery, the abbot knelt at the grave of the Silver Lance. His face was rigid. After kneeling like stone for a moment, he said slowly, "Tomorrow, Albrecht, they go. Crusader sons with the crusader spirit." With eyes fixed on the turf as if he were looking into the face of his friend, he went on. "You remember Bertrand. He came with us from Moulins. I am giving him a cross tomorrow and 12 men. They go south. They are to take up their abode by the Grosny. Walter, Bishop of Chalon, and 2 noblemen gave us the land. It is a goodly stretch. This will be our first foundation. Let us call it La Ferté, or Firmitas, and let us pray that it be strong, that it be true to all we have worked for. Albrecht," he continued, "your silver lance must lead the way so that my Grecian column may arise. These men know the cause and the commander. See to it that the secret spot which you say lies deep in every man be touched. See to it that La Ferté be a home for shields for the Sacred Heart. See to it that poverty, simplicity, and solitude be the guiding principles and the leading stars. Tell Robert that stars are beginning to come out after dark. The next day they left. Bertrand was at the head, bearing a large cross. Behind him trailed 12 silent monks. Many who saw them were struck by the number and spoke of Christ and his 12. That was the very idea behind the number, and that was the spirit that animated the group. That was the day on which Citeaux became a mother. Her daughter, her first daughter, was living in the south. Stephen Harding rejoiced in the solution he had found for heaven's problem. But as the months mounted, he soon saw that the problem was far from being fully solved. Postulants kept lifting that heavy iron knocker on the abbey's front gate, and the church, the refectory, and the dormitory kept being overcrowded. The bees were still swarming, as Felix had foretold. But the problem became more intricate for the abbot. The veterans of early Moulins and even of early Citeaux were few, and not all of them were leaders. Whom did he have to place at the head of a band, and where should they go? Stephen grew worried. One day he called Gaudry to him and very bluntly said, "You know something of men. Is Hugh of Macon a leader?" The old warrior chuckled. "Men are different animals to lead, Reverend Father. In fact, they don't like to be led." Then rather musingly he went on, "The real leader of men is the man who can make others believe they are accompanying him, not following. He is the man who is wise enough to recognize, respect, and show due deference to the manhood in other men. He is the man who wins their confidence by showing his confidence in them." Then, with a quick lift of his eyes to his abbot, he said, "Not many men are that wise, but I think young Hugh of Macon is." Stephen smiled. "Don't you demand real superiority in your leaders?" "Oh, it's got to be there," said Gaudry quickly, "but it must not be paraded. Men demand superiority in their leaders, but at the same time they resent being made inferior. So the true superior is the man who makes inferiors feel equal, even though they know in their heart of hearts that they are not. This honest duplicity is one of human nature's queerest quirks. But why do you ask about Hugh?" The abbot drew out a map of France and placed beside it a list of the community. "We've got to make sense out of these two confusing things." Placing his stylus on an inked X, he said, "This is Citeaux. South here we have La Ferté. As a soldier, where would you say our next daughter house should be placed?" Gaudry glanced from his abbot to the map, then back to his abbot again. "It depends on what you want to do, Reverend Father. If you want to defend Citeaux, you would surround her on all sides and keep your daughters close to home. If you want Citeaux to expand, you've got to do two seemingly contradictory things. You've got to radiate even as you attract." The abbot smiled. It was good to be plotting with one who knew how to plot. "You've outlined my principles even before I've presented them, Gaudry. I want union. That's fundamental. But obviously, as you look at this list, I've got to have expansion." "That's phrasing it more exactly than I did, Reverend Father. Here then is our center. This will be the hub of the wheel." And the old soldier placed his finger on Citeaux. "You've already got one spoke down here in the south," and he indicated La Ferté. "Now you need 3 others, one here, and one right here," and his finger touched spots to the north, east, and west of Citeaux. "That will give you the union and expansion you desire. I speak of a wheel, for I think of the two forces in a revolving wheel. You see the application of the hub. We've got to hold our daughters to Citeaux, even as we send them out to the circumference of the circle, and his finger traced an arc through the points he had indicated. But you spoke of radiating and attracting. What do you mean? Practically the same thing. You see, Reverend Father, I've watched the steady stream of postulants come here. Citeaux is attracting them. And now Citeaux can radiate because of them. She has started already with La Ferté in the south. But now, if she is to continue to grow, La Ferté and every other daughter house must attract even as does Citeaux. In that way, only they will be able to radiate. Therefore, you've got to place your houses as near as you can to the intersections of different dioceses, on the border of different provinces, and fairly near to populous centers. That's what a soldier would do. Stephen bent over the map. He studied the position of La Ferté. She stood close to the intersections of the dioceses of Macon and Châlons. Her position then was fairly satisfying. The abbot now placed his stylus on a spot where three provinces met: Auxerre, Tonnerre, and Champagne. Look at this, Gaudry. This spot is not only tangent of three provinces, but also to three dioceses. I could set a table there and seat the bishops of Sens, Langres, and Auxerre to dinner without having any one of them leave his own diocese. Do you think that would be a favorable spot for a foundation? Gaudry squinted at the point, smiled, and said, "Excellent." "All right," said Stephen as he pushed the map aside and drew over the community list. "Now for the men. How does one train commanders, Gaudry?" "One doesn't," replied the old soldier. "We learn to walk by walking. We learn to command by commanding." Then he chuckled as he said, "We learn everything by making mistakes. The stumbles, falls, and bumps of babyhood were our most expert instructors in the art of walking, Reverend Father, and I more than suspect that our errors of judgment, our too hasty orders, and our humiliating defeats best teach us how to command. But something is worrying you, Reverend Father. What is it?" "Time," said Stephen. "Are they sufficiently trained? Are they grounded in the simplicity, the poverty, and the solitude that are the bases of our spirit? Do they love prayer and penance?" "Halt!" commanded Gaudry as he smiled at his superior. At Stephen's look of surprise, the old warrior said, "Your last question was wrongly phrased, Reverend Father. Nobody loves penance. Nobody can love penance. And I'd almost dare say the same thing for certain forms of prayer. They love the God to whom they pray, and the God to whom they pay reparation, but they do not and cannot love penance." "Become a philosopher in your old age, eh?" No, Reverend Father, becoming God conscious, that's all." "Well, what do you think, Gaudry? Do you think Hugh of Macon could lead 12 men to the spot I pointed out and have them live there as we are living here?" The old warrior thought a long time before his gray head nodded in assent. "As well as any man you've got on that list," he finally said. "But I must tell you that if you send him away, you'll be sending away half of young Bernard's heart. They have been the fastest of friends since childhood." "I've thought of that," said Stephen slowly. "But Bernard must get used to having his heart broken. It seems part of God's technique in the sculpting of his saints, Gaudry. He breaks the human heart again and again, but only to refashion it closer to his own. Who knows but that is the secret of the 7 swords that were scabbarded in Mary's immaculate breast." "Sanctity costs, doesn't it?" came the slow question from the warrior, whose eyes were looking far, far away. "Yes," said Stephen quickly. "It costs much. But Gaudry, the price is always in our purses. We fail to purchase it not because we are poor, but because we are miserly. we won't pay the price. Here is a perfect example of how easy it is to purchase sanctity if we will. This separation between Bernard and Hugh is going to hurt. Now they can react naturally or supernaturally. They can take that hurt and nurse it, pout over it, groan and lament over the loneliness and lovelessness in the religious life, or they can smile outwardly even as inwardly they smart. They can cheer one another on as they part, even as they secretly tell Christ to take the pain that is in their soul and use it as incense to be burned in the brazier of his sacred heart and offered to the Godhead in praise and reparation. To do this latter thing does not take away the sting. No, indeed. It often increases because of the very denial of the relief that would come from an outward expression of human grief. But you know which of the two ways is the virtuous way? You know which will make the man of God and which the maudlin monk. Yes, Gaudry, sanctity costs, but we always have the price. The only question is, will we pay it? Gaudry rose on that question. Thank you, Reverend Father, he said. You have shown me a valuable truth. Sanctity has always appeared some distant, practically unattainable thing to me. Because it is supernatural, I suppose, I believed that it had little relation to the natural me. I see now how dull I have been. I see now that my sanctity must be bought with the coin I make from the metal of my everyday actions and reactions. I also see that Bernard and Hugh must amend their sorrow. Then slowly he added, Perhaps that is the easiest of all metals to work on, Reverend Father. My difficulty in coining the pleasure God sends me. My difficulty is coining the pleasure God sends me. The abbot looked long at the old warrior who had gray at his temples and sincerity burning as bright as silver in his eyes. Then he smiled warmly. Gaudry, he said, if the youngsters have learned as well as you, I can put aside all my worries. They will be gallant to God. That's a very choice compliment, Reverend Father, said the nobleman with a bow. I thank you for your kindness, but must refuse to accept the praise. Those youngsters have learned faster and more fully than I. We must wait and see, said Stephen as the old warrior left. A week later, Hugh of Macon shouldered a 5-foot wooden cross and with 12 men marching behind him, walked west to Pontigny. Citeaux had her second daughter, and there was a little more room at the mother house. That was in 1114. But 1115 gave Stephen little rest. The influx of novices had been greater than ever. Busy as he was with their training, he did not forget his own plan for the order. He talked the situation over with Gaudry a few times, but nothing new came out of the discussions. The plan of a wheel with Citeaux as its hub was Gaudry's fixed plan. Whenever Stephen spoke of leaders, the old warrior always pointed to younger men. They had the daring, he said, and daring was needed for such an enterprise as this. Old men were too cautious. That his abbot took his advice was evidenced the day Arnold of Cologne was selected to lead a group of 12 to the east. He founded the Abbey of Mormont, which lay close to the dioceses of Toul, Langres, and Besançon. Gaudry's plan was being very closely followed. Then, before the year was out, Stephen did one of the most human things of his saintly career. Over the protests of some of the elders, he called Bernard of Fontaines to him, and despite his youth, his delicate health, and his exaggerated zeal, he made him the leader of the group that was to go north. In that group were his uncle Gaudry, his 4 brothers, Guy, Gerard, Andrew, and Bartholomew, and 7 of his cousins and intimate friends. It was a very select group. Had Bernard been allowed his own choosing, he would have named the very 12 the abbot had designated. Just before the group gathered for departure, Gaudry went to the abbot's room and said, Some of God's saints can be very human persons, can't they, Reverend Father? The abbot smiled. That's a very considerate thing you are doing for Bernard and his brothers. And how about his uncle? Asked Stephen with a broader smile. His uncle has a puzzle, Reverend Father. You see, he wants to become a saint, and one time you said that to make his saints, God breaks their human hearts so that he can remodel them on his own divine one. Now Galdry's heart is not broken by this appointment. Stephen arose, and as they made their way to the door, he said, When I was a boy, I heard an old farmer say, Never count your chickens before they are hatched. When I was a young man, I heard an old sailor say, There is always a calm before the storm. Now that I am an aging monk, I know that he is a very wise man who, in time of consolation, prepares his soul for desolation. Watch your heart action the next few years, Galdry. The old warrior smiled. A few minutes later, his smile was forgotten in surprise as he watched the usually undemonstrative Stephen Harding break down in tears as he bade the little group farewell. When he heard the humble abbot begging young Bartholomew to pray for him, Galdry said to himself, I had forgotten that someone else's heart was engaged in this affair. It looks as if God is still at his sculpting. Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 4. This chapter is entitled, The Problem Becomes More Complicated. Stephen Harding's heart had been wrenched that day, just as it had been wrenched those other days on which he had said farewell to little groups of men he had trained to be gallant to God. But a few weeks later, when he took down the map and placed an inked X to the north and printed in Clairvaux, he breathed more easily. The four spokes of Galdry's wheel were now complete. Citeaux was circled by daughter houses. Stephen could look north, south, east, and west, and no matter which way he turned, he would be facing some of his men. But then, just as he began to breathe more easily, he was forced to catch his breath. An unexpected but very welcome visitor came one day in the person of his quondam fellow pilgrim, Peter. It was not raining, but the monk from Cluny claimed to be drenched. He said it was his only excuse for stopping. When the abbot felt of his clothes, Peter smiled and said, Sun-drenched, Reverend Father. I need the shade of Citeaux for a few hours. Stephen tried to persuade him that he needed it for a few days, but Peter's only reply was, Get behind me, Satan. The monk from Cluny warmly congratulated Stephen on the success he was having at Citeaux. He told him that the world had stopped laughing and had begun to marvel. Nothing like it had happened in the history of the province. Burgundy was dazed. Only 5 short years ago, she had predicted the death and the burial of the fanatic in the woods. Now she had to witness the growth and diffusion of the very group she had expected to dwindle and die. Citeaux was still the talk of the duchy, but the tone of the conversation had greatly changed. When Stephen showed him the map, Peter nodded approvingly and said, You will grow. Yes, you will grow. The friends were having a delightful visit until Peter said, I suppose you will be Grand Abbot of all these houses. It was then that Stephen Harding caught his breath. He had not thought of this. You've given me something to think about, Peter, he said slowly. I do not want to be Grand Abbot. Why? Because it would make you like Cluny? No, because it would make me unlike Saint Benedict. He legislated for a single monastery, not for an order, and you're growing into an order. I know it, but it's going to be a Benedictine order. The saint legislated for a single monastery, as you say, but his plan of absolute self-government is clear. Don't be foolish, Stephen, retorted Peter. You can't reconcile the irreconcilables. Either your daughter houses are going to be dependent, or they are not going to be daughter houses. And Citeaux is either going to be supreme, or she is not going to be mother. Cluny has solved the problem that faces you. Her ruler is Grand Abbot. The superiors of all daughter houses are priors, subject to him. Therefore, we have extended the patriarchal form that Saint Benedict planned for a single monastery to the whole host of family houses. You have destroyed Benedict's patriarchal form, you mean, and you set up an absolute monarchy. Peter made an attempt to protest, but the abbot continued. You know you must admit that, Peter. Cluny is a monarchy. She always has been and always will be. There is great advantage in that form of government. With a capable, saintly man as abbot of Cluny, the order will function perfectly. You have a union and a unity impossible under any other form of government. But I don't like it. You're hard to please. Very, admitted Stephen, smiling but insistent. I have two big objections to a monarchy. It places too much power in the hands of one man, and it is not Benedictine. Well, if you don't adopt it, your reform is going to fail. Divide and conquer is more than an axiom. It is a whole plan of campaign. Diffusion is always dangerous, Stephen. Wise mothers always tie young children to their apron strings. Let your daughters go their way, and away will go your reform. I know it, said Stephen with a frown. Concentration is one secret of power and success. Diffusion always lessens fervor and ultimately leads to failure. Cluny survives and survives well, and yet I can't adopt her system. Then how in the world are you going to keep the next generation of Cistercians from being merely white Benedictines, or if you prefer it, Cluniacs not in black? You've got something unique here. You've done what no one but yourself thought possible. You admit it? Asked Stephen with a trace of a smile. Oh, all of us who are honest must admit it, but that's not my point. My point is that you should hold on to what you have. You should perpetuate it. And the only way you can do that is by tying your daughters to your apron strings. Everything has a tendency to go down. Man is no exception. I don't mean the physical man, I mean the spiritual one. Now, how are you going to keep your daughter houses and your granddaughter houses from forgetting the poverty, simplicity, the silence, the solitude, the rigid regularity of Citeaux? You simply can't do it unless you become a monarch. Well, Peter, I'll not become a monarch, and I will find a way to keep my daughters and their daughters from being wayward. How can you? But there Peter stopped and laughed. You've been doing such amazing things already that I guess I had better hold my tongue. I'm glad you loosened it, Peter. You've helped me see how complicated my problem really is. A wise general learns the strength of his enemy. Yes, you've opened my eyes by loosening your tongue. You've presented me with a seeming impossibility. I want every daughter house of Citeaux to be absolutely self-governing, for that is what Saint Benedict demands. And yet I want them to be daughters of Citeaux. How can I wed dependence and independence? I'm glad it's not my problem, said Peter, but don't despair. You've made black white already, and he touched his own in the abbot's habit. You've made the ancient modern and the modern ancient. You've made the letter of the law its spirit, and the spirit of the law its letter. I'm beginning to suspect you're a magician. And I'm beginning to suspect that I'm a bewildered and very befuddled monk. You've given me enough matter for wrinkles as deep as the bone. How can I keep my daughters from running away, and yet not behave as a domineering, tyrannical mother? You're not going to give me wrinkles, Stephen. I was never good at riddles, and I've shied from the impossible all my life. I hate to leave you to your problem, but I know I couldn't help you, no matter how much I worried over it. I'm not the planner you are, but I'll remember you in some of those rosaries I say every day." For weeks after Peter left, Stephen's brow was wrinkled. He became the rationalist again, the man who looked through facts to get at principles. Other reforms had flourished, then faded. He was determined to discover why. Peter had given one reason when he spoke of the innate tendency downwards that is in every man. What is true of individual men would be true of individual monasteries, he argued. How could he keep his new houses on the level of old Citeaux? How could he check that innate tendency downwards and yet not disturb the individual's independence? He took his problem to Albrecht, but for once his old friend was silent. He took it to the church, but neither the tabernacle nor the crucifix spoke to him as yet. For months and months he thought and prayed and thought. Then it came. When it came, it seemed so simple that he feared it would not work. It seemed so obvious that he marveled that he had not thought of it before. He wrote his ideas in longhand and read his plan. It seemed so easy a solution that he wondered if it was really the answer. He took down his map and studied it. Lines were drawn from house to house to show their relations. It seemed the most natural thing in the world. Why hadn't someone thought of it before? Could there be something he was missing? I wish I had Peter here to argue it out, he thought. And close on this came the realization. If I can't have Peter, I can find as good, if not better. He did. In 1116, he summoned the 4 abbots of Citeaux's 4 daughter houses. If 2 heads are better than 1, then 4 heads should be better than 2, thought Stephen. But he did not get 4. Only 3 came, for Bernard of Clairvaux was too ill to attend. Before Bertrand, Hugh, and Arnold, Stephen laid his plan. They understood his antipathy toward monarchy and his desire for the patriarchy of St. Benedict, and also his hope to bind the houses together in some sort of union. Then he outlined the idea, which appealed to him as highly practicable. It was this: each house was to be autonomous. Moremond was to be Moremond and not a subject to Citeaux. Pontigny was to be independent Pontigny and not an appendage, so also for Clairvaux and La Ferté. That was what St. Benedict prescribed. But to keep Pontigny from being different from Citeaux, to keep La Ferté from having customs at variance with those at Citeaux, to keep Moremond from introducing compromises and Clairvaux from countenancing mitigations, all 4 houses must be bound to Citeaux. Let the bond be that of charity, a mutual charity, manifested in mutual supervision. He then explained what he meant by this. The abbot of Citeaux would visit his daughters once every year, not to interfere in purely temporal affairs, not to administer the estate, not to dispose in any way of the personnel of the community, not to do anything but to see that the daughter was staying true to the family traditions. Hugh asked, "Suppose a difference of opinions should arise, what then?" "Charity is the bond, I know, and charity covers a multitude of sins. But suppose La Ferté should deny that she was sinning, and Pontigny should insist she was. Or suppose Clairvaux disagrees with Moremond. Is Citeaux to be the final court of appeal? And what if all the daughters disagree with the mother? In other words, Reverend Father, where is authority vested? The natural place would seem to be Citeaux. But if you do that, then despite your bond of charity, expressed in mutual supervision, you have another monarchy, a Cluny with a Cistercian frill." Stephen shook his head and drummed on his desk. "I thought my plan was too simple. Pontigny has seen deeper than Citeaux." "You are right, Hugh. authority must be vested in somebody, and that somebody must not be Citeaux. How are we going to get around that? There was silence for a while. There must be a final court of appeal, mused Stephen. Why can't it be Citeaux? Asked Arnold. Because, as Pontigny has pointed out, we would then be Cluny with a false face. There followed a few other suggestions, but none of them satisfied. Either they ultimately came down to a monarchy, or they did not represent a court of final appeal. At length, Bertrand said, "Your ground plan is sound, Reverend Father. Mutual charity can be the bond, and utter independence can be had by each individual house. Your idea of mutual supervision is sound too. That will keep us all like Citeaux. This difficulty presented by Hugh is a difficulty, but it does not destroy your ground plan. It is merely a final detail that needs elaboration." Nodding heads told Bertrand that he had pleased both Arnold and Hugh, but Stephen was frowning. "I wish I could see it as a mere detail, but there is little more that we can do about it today. I know you men are anxious to get back to your monasteries. Let us all pray over it and think over it. If any suggestion comes to you, send it on. If I elaborate this mere detail of Bertrand's, I'll send for you. In the meantime, be true to your traditions." They left then, and it was a full 3 years before they met again. But when they did meet, it was not 3 abbots and Stephen that entered into consultation, but 9 abbots and Stephen. From 1116 to 1119, Citeaux had sent out no fewer than 5 new colonies. How exactly Felix's words were being fulfilled? Citeaux was swarming, and her abbot was busier than any bee. He trained novices, chose groups for new foundations, selected superiors, arranged locations, and ruled Citeaux. In the midst of all these activities, he found time, somehow or other, to elaborate the mere detail, as Bertrand called it. And it was this elaboration that gave the world the masterpiece of monastic legislation, Stephen Harding's justly famed Charter of Charity. This he laid before the assembled abbots. The veterans from La Ferté, Moremont, and Pontigny enjoyed the expressions of warm enthusiasm of the younger members of the assembly for the first part of the document. This described the plan as they had heard it at their last meeting. Each monastery was an individual family under its father, and yet each house was in a certain sense under the abbot of the mother house whence she sprang. He was the father immediate, who was to visit his daughter annually to see that she was manifesting every family trait. But what the veterans were anxious about was the second part. Could it really solve Hugh's problem, provide for both unity and freedom? When they read it, they were silent. It seemed unbelievable. Stephen had done it again. He had united dependence and independence. Hugh of Macon chuckled as he pointed out the passage to Bernard of Fontaine. "I am responsible for this," he said. 3 years ago I proposed what looked like an insurmountable difficulty. I wanted authority vested in someone, and I said, if that someone was Citeaux, then we are a monarchy. Look at the solution. It seems so obvious and simple that one is tempted to say, if it was a dog, it would bite you. Bernard smiled. Don't you know, Hugh, that every discovery of genius has appeared obvious and simple after it has been discovered? Let me look at the solution again. Taking the paper, he read the passage. Yes, he said, that's the solution. Stephen places supreme authority in the hands of a body, not of an individual. He wants all the abbots assembled in general chapter to be the final court of appeal. That certainly is avoiding a monarchy, isn't it? Now, why couldn't I have thought of that 3 years ago? Exclaimed Hugh. The 3 of us were sitting here, Arnold. Bertrand and myself. There was Stephen. I proposed the problem. I said, if we place all the authority in your hands, we have a monarchy, which we don't want. Now, why couldn't I have gone on and said, let us place it all in our hands and we'll have an aristocracy, which we do want? Simply because you're not a genius, Hugh. Then you admit that this is a stroke of genius? Who would dare deny it? Stephen? Bernard's large eyes danced with merriment. You sound put out that he should deny it. Don't you know the man's humility? He'll most likely beg our pardons for having been so stupidly slow. Just then Stephen came in. The 10 abbots sat around a long table. With care and precision, Stephen explained every line of his charter. It was to create a new order in which the legislative, judicial, and coercive powers were to be placed not in any one individual, but in the moral person constituted by all the abbots assembled in general chapter. It was to be an order in which every house was to be absolutely autonomous, yet under the supervision of one whose duty it would be to see that the customs of Citeaux were observed. It was to be an order whose members were bound to their local abbot by the bonds of filial love, to their fellow members by the bonds of brotherly love, and to the mother house and all other houses by the bonds of mutual love. Then Stephen defined very clearly the duties of the fathers immediate. Again and again he insisted that they were not to rule the house they visited. They were merely to make a paternal call to see that the rule was being observed in the manner of Citeaux. Finally, he read the stipulations governing the general chapter. They were few but stringent. It was to be held once a year. All were to be present. Only the gravest of grave excuses would exempt any abbot. Its work was to correct abuses, maintain regular discipline, and strengthen the bonds of peace and charity. At the close of the session, Hugh, still rejoicing over the new charter, exclaimed to Bernard, "His purpose reads like a lyric. Listen." Quote, "that we live united in the observance of the same rule, according to the same customs, and in a common charity." Unquote. "Those aren't the lines of a lyric," replied Bernard. "They are the prologue to an epic." Three Religious Revels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 5. This chapter is entitled, "The World Provides Stephen with Amusement." Stephen was amused to hear his spiritual sons so enthused over his Carta Caritatis, but he felt very much as Hugh had felt. He wanted to know why he hadn't thought of all these simple solutions before. Nevertheless, when the abbots unanimously accepted it, he made a move very reminiscent of Albrecht. He took his carta, bound it with the Instituta, drawn up by the old silver lance, joined to these the Parvum Exordium, a short history of the founding of Citeaux, and sent this threefold volume to the Pope. The Rationalists had argued thus: "My abbots have approved the charter and accepted it as the fundamental institute of the order, but in the last analysis that is only a private agreement, entered into by independent individuals. What is to prevent an abbot in later years from saying, 'I was not a party to such an agreement'? There is nothing. But if I can get papal approval of the charter and ecclesiastical sanction of the order, my worries are over." Calixtus II was at Saulieu at the moment. He was the son of a Burgundian count, and Stephen felt sure that the lines in the exordium would awaken echoes of Citeaux's woods in the mind of the pontiff. He waited and prayed. Then, for a Christmas present, he received a bull dated "This 23rd day of December, 1119, the first year of our pontificate." It gave unconditional approbation to all three works that were in the volume, but more. It gave papal recognition and ecclesiastical sanction to the greatest work, the Order of Citeaux. The Christ child, through his visible representative on earth, had presented Stephen with the one present he longed for. In turn, Stephen offered to the infant the gold, frankincense, and myrrh that was the order of Citeaux. It was perhaps the happiest Christmas Stephen had ever spent. March, which had come in like a lion, had not yet shed his mane for the fleece of the lamb before the abbot began to laugh at the world and chuckled at himself. The world was puzzled and somewhat bewildered. It could not understand what was taking place. Not only in Burgundy, but all France seemed to be drifting toward Citeaux or one of her daughter houses. Stephen laughed at the world's perplexity. He could have solved it by telling the world that an old soldier had planned a wheel with Citeaux as its hub, that he had insisted that the wheel spokes be placed in such a position that they drew even as they radiated. The world would have understood, for Citeaux was now a grandmother. Her daughters had so grown that they had children of their own. Indeed, Gaudry's tactics were telling. Stephen's laugh at himself, however, was not so filled with amusement, for he saw that he had not yet solved all of the problems heaven had presented him. Just as Hugh had pointed out one deficiency in his original plan, he himself now saw one in the plan he had thought completed. Stephen knew something of the convolutions of the human brain. He felt sure that someday, somewhere, someone would come along and begin to distinguish and subdistinguish the various lines and even the various phrases and words in his charter of charity. It had been done with St. Benedict's rule, and look at the confusion that resulted. He must plan a preventative. He must devise some method to keep future generations from saying, "This is not the way Citeaux interpreted it. That is not the way it was done in the old days. That is not what our fathers meant." He went to his desk, bent over it, and stayed at the task until he could say it is finished. The idea had come to him that the only remedy, the only preventative, would be a book of usages, in which, with extreme exactness, every custom of Citeaux would be stated. It was a trying work, for there were many customs. It was a time-consuming work, for it demanded great precision. But Stephen did not scruple about the time, for he knew he was preserving an order. The years went by, until one day he sat back from his desk with an emphatic and expressive, "There, it is done. It will take real mental magic to deny or distinguish any one of those lines. At last I think the problem is solved." And it was. With the final punctuation point to his Book of Usages, Stephen actually completed the rebellion that had begun almost a century before. In 1033, Robert, a boy of 15, fresh from Troyes, heard an aging abbot ask, "What would Benedict say?" That sentence had served as a flint from which to strike the spark that would one day light all Europe. But it was a very slow mounting fire, for it was only now, almost 100 years later, that Benedict could ask the same question and answer it with, "Benedict would say it is perfect." Year after year, a steady and ever-swelling stream of knights and nobles, vassals and serfs went to Citeaux and her daughter houses. Burgundy soon ceased to be the only province inland with her white monks. Before long, France was not the only country in the world that could boast of her silent Cistercians, for Italy had her foundations, and Hugh of Macon at Pontigny became father immediate to many German daughters. The entire continent was becoming conscious of Citeaux. With something like a touch of nostalgia, Stephen saw his sons cross the seas and settle in his native England. Finally, in 1132, the Pyrenees were crossed and Spanish hidalgos were set seeking heaven the Cistercian way of being gallant to God. The world was not only puzzled, she was somewhat angry. Only a short 20 years had passed since she predicted the slow death of the abbey in the swamp. Now she found the Citeaux overshadowing congregations that were centuries old. The Citeaux that Stephen had feared might be a haunted house with a crowded cemetery had suddenly sprung to life, burst its swaddling bands, and spread out to 75 different places. In 1132, Stephen surprised the world again. He founded the first Cistercian monastery for nuns. People had said the Cistercian regime was too strenuous for men. Stephen showed what he thought of the world's opinion by giving the identical regime to women. It was at Tarbes, near Dijon, that he opened the first house. And the women outdid the men. Their houses multiplied faster, and they went further. Small wonder the world was shocked and bewildered. Ladies and lords, knights and highborn maids, servant girls, serfs, all of these flocked to this austere mode of living. Europe could not believe its eyes. Stephen thought again and again of how right Albrecht had been. There is a secret spot in the soul of every man and woman, which, once touched, makes each one more than man or woman. He himself, too, had been right in thinking that men and women love a challenge, that they love to do the daring, difficult, different thing. And old brave Robert had been right. Stars do come out after dark. He thanked God again and again, but in his deepest prayer he saw that Christ had been most right. And I, if I be lifted up, will draw all things to myself. That was the real explanation for this extraordinary drift toward Citeaux and the Cistercians. Christ was calling. His voice was irresistible. Citeaux had found her place in the mystical body of Christ. In late August, just as summer began to droop, an aged monk made his way to Citeaux and asked to see Stephen Harding. When asked his name, the old man smiled and said, "Tell him it's his fellow pilgrim. He'll understand." And Stephen did understand. With more energy than he had shown in months, he groped his way to the door. His eyes had gone dim. As he took his friend's arm and slowly led him to a chair, he said, "We have almost reached our journey's end. Come in, Peter, and tell me how goes the road." "I have come to learn the road," replied the smiling Cluniac. "There's something magical about Citeaux. I must learn it. Tell me what it is, Stephen." The two friends sat then and looked at each other. Stephen was the first to smile and say, "We are withered, Peter. We are two yellowed leaves, slowly shriveling in the sun of life's late autumn." "I know it," replied Peter, "and I marvel at the fact, for spring seemed only yesterday. What happened to our summer?" "Mine went draining swamps," laughed Stephen. "Yours went singing the praises of God." "Yours went digging deep foundations for a structure whose height no one yet dares guess. What happened, Stephen, and what is yet to happen?" "Don't ask me riddles, Peter," said the old abbot as he shook his head. "My weary old brain won't work on them. Years and years ago I told you that I felt that Citeaux's mission was to shock the world. I told you then that I felt it was the work of God more than the work of man. I think that you will now admit that she has shocked the world." Peter's old face wrinkled and his eyes danced as he shook with laughter. "Ah, the old fire still flames. Good for you, Stephen. But come now, let me in on the secret. How do you do it? Show me the mold in which you cast your men." Hours then went by in wide-ranging conversation. Bernard, who was now recognized as the voice of Christendom, was a fertile source for comment. He had made kings tremble, sustained popes, swayed whole nations, and was now dominating Europe. His abbey of Clairvaux was outdoing Citeaux in the number of new foundations. Such a topic was dear to the heart of old Stephen, and there were other topics, just as dear, but not so comforting. Peter talked of the papacy, an ache to the aged abbot's heart. At the moment, Christendom was almost split in schism because of the rival claims of two men for the chair of Peter. Anacletus and Innocent both called themselves Pope. Bernard had declared for Innocent and had won France, Germany, England, and parts of Italy to his side. But Peter de Leon was stubborn, and the battle still went on. Stephen ached for his boy, Bernard, who was in the thick of the fight, but he ached even more for the Church of Christ. But Peter was ever coming back to the same topic, the wonder of Citeaux. When, for the 6th or 7th time, Peter asked, "What's the secret?" Stephen said, "I'll tell you if you'll tell me what's wrong with the world." "Greed," replied Peter with conviction. Stephen shook his head. "Not deep enough, Peter. You're explaining much, but not all. Nobles are greedy. That explains quarrels with the church, quarrels with other states, quarrels with themselves." "It explains everything," said Peter with warmth. "We wouldn't have near schism if Peter de Leon and his faction were not greedy for power. We wouldn't have this constant struggle between princes and prelates if kings and emperors and all under them weren't greedy for the wealth they say lies in the estates of the church. We wouldn't have scandals if lords, knights, and ladies weren't greedy for pleasure. We wouldn't have a lot of things if greed was not right in the very makeup of man. Indeed, Stephen, you can bring most of our troubles right down to greediness." The abbot nodded. "True, Peter, but when the tower topples, don't look to the walls, look to the foundations. When the flower is puny, don't examine the leaves, examine the roots. When the fruit of a tree is bad, don't blame the blossoms or the bark, look under the soil." "What's deeper than greed?" asked Peter. "It's in the very marrow of the bone." "Perhaps it is, but there is something that produces that marrow. For instance, Peter, we have heard much about feudal lords and feudal barons, about feudal icings and feudal emperors, haven't we? We have been told that lay investiture has been the result of the greed of these men. That's not the ultimate cause, no. The ultimate cause is not the feudal sovereigns, it is the feudal system." "How?" questioned Peter. "If bishops and abbots were not themselves temporal lords with vast estates and many vassals, the temporal sovereigns would never bother them. You can't imagine the Duke of Burgundy or the King of France becoming interested in little Citeaux or Citeaux's abbot, can you? No. Why? We're poor. Our estate is small. We have no vassals. So neither men nor money is to be had from the swamplands. Therefore, we are left alone. But if you keep on growing, if we keep to our ideal of simplicity, poverty, solitude, we'll never be bothered. The houses may multiply and the order become powerful, but no individual abbey will ever be the envy of any temporal lord. But the point I make is that there is always something deeper than what appears. It would seem that lay investiture were the result of feudal sovereigns. It is not. It is the result of the feudal system. So too with the world. It would seem that her troubles come from greed, from lust, from selfishness, from sin. But the root of all her troubles is lack of faith. But Stephen, they are calling this the age of faith. I know they are, and it amuses me. One look at the history of the papacy for the past century will tell you how well the age is named. If the Italian counts and the Italian people had faith, do you think they could riot and revolt the way they have at every papal election for the past 100 years? If the German emperors had faith, do you think they could set up anti-popes the way they have and handle the chair of Peter as if it were a princess bauble? If our French kings had faith, do you think we would have had the matrimonial scandals that have shamed us and our rulers for years and years? The truth is, Peter, that the people do not believe what they profess to believe. Peter realized that Stephen was right. The trouble with the age was not what so many had been decrying. It was not avarice, not ambition, not mad hunger for glory. The trouble lay deeper. Stephen had touched bottom when he touched of the lack of faith. Thoughts were tumbling through Peter's mind in frightening fashion. The abbot's last phrase, "People do not believe what they profess to believe," had him examining his own conscience. Did he believe with a telling, throbbing, productive belief that he was in the service of God? When he sang his office, did he really believe that he was singing as the angels sang, directly into the face of God? When he received Holy Communion? But before the questions became too disturbing, Stephen interrupted. "People do not believe the first commandment, Peter, and that is why Citeaux is shocking the world." "She does." "What do you mean?" "I mean that we are living the tremendous truth that people treat so triflingly. God made us to adore, Peter. That is humanity's prime function. Adoration is in our blood, our bone, our deepest being. Just as flame naturally leaps up, so do our souls surge to adore." The abbot grew intense. "Why did God make me, Peter, or you, or those thousands and hundreds of thousands out there beyond our woods? Why? To adore him. Oh, Peter, believe me, that first commandment is first. We must adore God. The prime purpose of creation is to give glory to God, and what an opportunity is given to monks to fulfill that prime purpose. The world does not yet know just what it is about Citeaux that amazes her. It's the austerity, the penance, the utter otherworldliness," put in Peter. "It is not. What amazes her is Citeaux's burning sincerity. Here men are living the belief they profess. They are keeping the first commandment first. Penance, austerity, otherworldliness? Look deeper, man." "But your labor, your fast, your extreme poverty." "The rind," said Stephen. "Only the rind. The pulp, the edible part of the fruit, is beneath all that. You want the secret of Citeaux? Well, I'll give it to you. The bleeding hearts of the two broken-hearted lovers of the world are our secret, the hearts of Jesus and Mary. That is the whole secret of Citeaux, Peter. Cistercians are lovers. We all know Jesus and Mary. We all know their love. But how is it that you take worldlings, nobles, knights, lords, and serfs, and make them lovers of Christ? That's the puzzle. You make those truths true. Now that is magic. What wand do you use?" "Come," said Stephen, as he laboriously lifted himself from his chair. "Come with me and I'll show you." Slowly the two old men went along the corridors. When they reached the church, Stephen pointed up to the life-size crucifix. It was plain wood, with a bloody, bruised, horribly beaten Christ painted on it. "There," said the old abbot breathlessly, "there is my magic wand. If the wood of the cross won't change men, nothing will. Christ took all that, all those blows, all that blood, those nails, those thorns, the spittle, all for me. He loved me." Stephen sank to his knees. Peter knelt down beside him. The abbot was weeping. For quite some time, the two old men knelt in prayer. Stephen was the first to move. By grasping the cross, he was able to raise himself, and when he looked up at the bleeding figure so realistically painted on the wood, Peter saw a light in his eyes that he had never seen on earth before. It was ecstasy. Silently then, the abbot led him to the sacristy, and drawing forth the brass censer, he stretched it out on the vesting table. Pointing to it, he quietly said, "There is my mold." Peter frowned. "Mold?" he repeated. I don't understand." "Think, Peter, think. The first commandment. We Cistercians are adorers. We take our lives as so much aromatic incense and fling them with reckless hands into love's brazier. We want to burn out in the presence of the two I told you about, the broken hearts. We want perfumed clouds of white adoration to ascend unceasingly before the throne of God. That's why we have locked ourselves behind monastery walls. That is why we came to this swampland. We came to adore. You asked to see my mold. There it is. Into it I try to cast every soul that comes under my care, for I am convinced that the first things should be first." Then he looked at Peter intently and said more slowly, "Peter, I am convinced that a monk is one who should lie prostrate endlessly before the majesty of God, worshiping him with all his might." The two old friends groped their way back to the abbot's room. When they were seated, Stephen smiled and said, "You asked for the secret of Citeaux." "I think you have shown it to me," said Peter slowly. "No," replied Stephen with a shake of his head, "I have not. For the secret of Citeaux is that she has no secret. And I say hers is an open secret. It is there for all the world to read. It is evident even in the position of your church. Stephen, you used a barbarous word with me once. You spoke of being God-orientated. Well, that's the secret of Citeaux. Even your church is facing due east. You've got your face to the sun. And if you'll allow me to play on words, you've got your face to the Son of God. I see now why Cistercians are so little self-conscious and so utterly unconscious of the world. They are entirely Christ-conscious, totally God-conscious. That's the reason. I'll now allow you your barbarous word and congratulate you on your achievement of all that the word connotes. Citeaux is completely God-orientated." Stephen nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he said softly. "Tell that secret to everyone you meet, won't you, Peter? God wants to look on faces that are lifted to his Son." The friends parted next day. It was their last meeting on earth. Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 6. This chapter is entitled Side by Side. A month after Peter's departure, the trees around the abbey were heavy with luscious, mellow fruit. Stephen's eyes had gone dim, but he scented golden maturity in every warm wind that climbed to his window from orchards and vineyards. The rich fragrance in these winds made him recall what he had said to Peter about being in the yellow leaf of life's late autumn. This in turn made him think of Albrecht. He saw now why the Silverlands had meditated so long on the scarlet leaf that year in the distant past. Stephen shook his head. He knew what this sensitivity to nature meant. Night was near. He must prepare for it. On the 14th of September, 1133, 75 abbots had assembled at Citeaux for their annual general chapter. Stephen had waited for this gathering anxiously. When all had taken their places in the meeting hall, the old abbot entered. It was a pathetic sight. His hands were trembling. He was groping his way, feeling for his chair. He sank into it weakly. With a prayer, the chapter was formally opened. When all were seated, Stephen arose and, looking at the assembly from his almost blinded eyes, he said, "My fathers, had I laid down the burden of office when still young, you might have accused me of faint-heartedness. But now, as you see, I am old. I am burdened with many infirmities. So if I beg to resign, tax me not with being presumptuous, but rather say that I am modest. As long as I was able, I put my shoulder to the wheel. I shrank not from any obligation. Thanks be to God, I saw to it that this tender plant strike deep root. Thanks be to God, the one little monastery I received has multiplied to almost 100. He stretched out his hands pleadingly. My fathers, it is not the will to serve that is wanting. No, it is the strength to do so." There was a long pause. Abbots of all ages, some nearing 80, some not yet 40, were silent. Their eyes surreptitiously traveled from the old man who stood at the head of the table to the little place card that stood before them. It seemed that they did not trust themselves to look at one another, lest they see reflected in the eyes of others the grief they felt was mirrored in their own. It was heartbreaking. The voice was pleading, and yet in it there was a note of regret. My fathers, allow an old man. There was a noticeable lingering on that word, old. Allow an old man to take his rest. Stephen Harding, asking for a rest? Was it possible? But no. The question faded from every eye as the old man went on. It was in a clearer tone and a more vibrant voice, with a ring of determination in it. Allow an old man to take a rest that he may provide for all his own needs. No, indeed. Stephen was not asking for a rest. He was asking for freedom to begin more intensive work. With reluctance, reverence, and regret, the abbots yielded. Tears were seen in many an eye as they voted acceptance. They knew that the request was reasonable. Age and infirmity were on him, but so too were sanctity and love. However, they yielded and proceeded to elect his successor. Then a strange thing happened. Guy, the abbot of Three Fountains, was elected. But Guy, the abbot of Three Fountains, was not a holy man. Stephen knew that. He was the only one in the chapter who did not know it. He was the only one in the chapter who did know it. Guy was not the man to head the young order of Citeaux. But what could Stephen do? His resignation had just been accepted. If he interfered now, what sort of a resignation would it appear? He must remain silent. It was an effort, but he preserved his silence before men that he might become more and more conversant with God. Day after day, the old man groped his way to the life-sized crucifix and bent himself like Magdalene at its foot. Day after day, he prostrated himself before the tabernacle, asking Christ to protect little Citeaux. A month went by. It was a worry-filled month and a prayer-filled one. Then the others saw what Stephen had known. Guy was immediately deposed. Reynard was elected. He had been a monk at Clairvaux. He had been trained by Saint Bernard. Stephen rejoiced. He knew his young order was in capable hands. Then he went to work on his last great work, his immediate preparation for death. Winter was melting into spring. Daffodils nodded above the cracked and softening earth. Fresh green was showing above the graves in the little cemetery as the abbots gathered again at Citeaux. But no general chapter summoned them this time. They had come to crowd around the deathbed of their founder, to receive a blessing, to catch a last word, and to assist him if they could. Stephen was dying. The old man lingered. One would have thought that he was loath to leave without a word from his boy Bernard, but Bernard could not come. He was away in the cause of innocent, still fighting for Christ's true vicar on earth. The old heart pulsed slowly. Stephen was fighting his last fight. The kneeling abbots began to whisper to one another. They were soft sentences full of reverence and love. He has had a long life, said one. Yes, and one filled with good works, replied another. He won't be empty-handed when he meets his Maker. His was a generous life, whispered a young abbot. Indeed it was, came the answer, and God will reward him for it. Then a little louder than the others, one voice was heard saying, Indeed, we can call him blessed. Stephen stirred. Light came back into the old eyes. Turning a weary head, he raised a thin, vibrant voice and said, I hear you speak, my fathers. What is this you say? I tell you truly, I go to God trembling, as anxious as if I had never done a single good deed. He paused. The old eyes closed a moment. The breathing was labored. But again that thin, vibrant voice was raised. If there has been any good in my actions, or if any good has come from my poor labors, it is all due to the grace of God. In the hush, the labored breathing of the dying man was greatly accentuated. Then came the last sentence. I fear and tremble much that I have not fully corresponded with that grace, and that I have not received it with the proper humility. Stephen Harding's last sentence had been spoken. He had strained to get out that last word. He had lingered on it. The kneeling abbots knew that in it he had summed up his life and given the key to his sanctity. More, they knew that he had indicated the predominant virtue of his order, when with his dying gasp he had said, humility. It was the 28th of March, 1134. Spring had just arrived. It was a glad spring, and life was bursting in flower and tree. Citeaux herself was quietly happy in the midst of this resurgence. She was lonely as she stood by the corpse of her father, but she was not sad, for she knew that he had gone to God. No longer would the venerable abbot grope after him. No longer would he strain those dim eyes in an effort to pierce the veils. No longer would he gaze on God through the twilight of faith. He now saw him face to face, and little Citeaux quietly rejoiced. Next day they carried the worn frame to the graveyard. They sang as they did it, and their music was not somber nor sad. It was song that was reverent and holy. It was brightened by overtones of joy. And why not? Were they not doing honor to a warrior? Were they not paying homage to God? They begged that all be forgiven, it is true, but what they really meant by their song was, welcome him home. They laid him beside Albric. It was most fitting, for their lives and their loves had been the same, and the rebels would ever lie side by side, so that they might rise shoulder to shoulder for the last grand general chapter of the whole human race. Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 7. This chapter is entitled A Crooked Staff. When all was over, the abbots, monks, and lay brothers returned to the monastery. Many were looking for remembrances. Some openly called them relics. Their search was almost vain, for Stephen lived his poverty, and poverty in life meant poverty in death. Citeaux, however, found a remembrance, and she made of it a relic. It was not much to look at. It was a perfect emblem of his life. To those who could read, it told the whole secret of the sanctity of Citeaux. It was Stephen's crozier, just an old crooked staff. For centuries, Citeaux venerated that relic, and during those centuries, future Cistercians learned the story of the Rationalist who completed the rebellion by his sustained drive for poverty, simplicity, and solitude. The staff told them even more. It told the virtue which should shine brightest in their lives, a virtue greater than their poverty, the virtue that Christ and St. Stephen loved, the virtue of humility. Yes, he is St. Stephen Harding, for Benedict XVI recognized his sanctity and in 1584 approved his cult. His Cistercian children observe his feast with more pomp and ceremony than they show on the feasts of his two friends, Robert and Albric, for Stephen was the rebel who completed the rebellion. He was the founder of the order. More, they remember that he was father in religion to the boy from Fontaine, the boy who became the man of Europe, Bernard, who aimed to overtake Christ. The crooked staff was the only material remembrance that Citeaux kept of this lovable Englishman. But Citeaux always kept his spirit, the spirit of being so thoroughly rational as to live poverty, simplicity, and solitude in all their grandeur, the spirit of being reckless enough to take life and fling it into love's brazier, there to burn and send up fragrant clouds of adoration to the one who made us all. The three religious rebels taught Citeaux how to be gallant to God, and she has never forgotten.